Good morning. How's everyone?
Wet.
Good. And hopefully the rain subside by 11 o'clock, so it'll be drier. This is a really very interesting topic that we have this morning on CO2 capture, and three very interesting speakers. But I'd like to just point out one thing about CO2 that many people don't realize. Our breathing is linked to how much CO2 there is in the air, because the air CO2 is our sink, and we burn our glucose and we throw our glucose CO2 out in the air. So if the air has a high level of CO2, we have difficulty discharging our CO2. So we don't burn that much glucose. And that is one reason why you feel sleepy, it's lethargic inside a room. If a room is closed, if your car is totally closed, and if you're driving, they say that about 25% of the accidents are because you're sleepy and lethargic, because you could not burn your glucose. There was way too much CO2 in the air. And when you go outside CO2 is now 420 ppm. It's a little easier than inside, which is about 1,000 ppm by design. So over the last 100 years, the feeling of freshness has gone down, because 100 years back, outside CO2 was 220 ppm, and it was much easier to discharge your CO2. And the whole control system for breathing is just based on CO2 in the blood, how easily you can discharge your CO2. So CO2 removal from air is really important for us to get back to the same freshness. And our first paper is given by Chris Googe. He's our associate professor in biology, and he has just done tremendous work on CO2 sequestration, and very interesting details. So I won't spend much time on going over the bio, but let's hear from Chris about the science and policy of forest carbon sequestration.
Thank you, Ram. And thank you all for being here on a rainy Friday morning, first thing. Really appreciate it. And if you're joining from Zoom, thank you for joining. It's a good day for forest carbon sequestration, right? Maybe not for us, we're wet, but the precipitation is appreciated by the ecosystems that surround us. So today I'm going to talk a bit about the science, or the fundamental science of forest carbon cycling and sequestration. And Ram did a really nice job introducing a part of the carbon cycle. And of course, plants are also a part of the carbon cycle. They can consume carbon dioxide. They do consume carbon dioxide. I'll talk a little bit about policy. That's not my primary area of expertise, but it is relevant, I think, to consider how forests interface with policy options for reducing atmospheric CO2. So preface it by saying that there is a lot of news out there almost daily. I suppose I pay attention to this news more than others, but about forest carbon sequestration, the importance of forests in managing our carbon footprint, offsetting our carbon footprint. And we see this in the popular press. We also see this in the scientific press and journals. This is a Nature commentary from less than a year ago, discussing the importance of studying forests, and particularly committing to long-term studies of forest carbon sequestration and biogeochemistry as we consider combating climate change. And the reason for this is forests contain a lot of carbon. If we were to take any of the trees out here in the courtyard, and please don't do this, and cut them down, dry them, weigh them, half of that dry mass would be carbon. So they contain carbon-rich compounds. They are carbon-rich organisms like us, and they're consuming carbon. And they're consuming carbon at a rate relative to other ecosystems that's quite a bit, results in quite a bit more storage. So by storage in this case, we mean the amount of carbon contained in an ecosystem. And in a forest, and in any ecosystem, that is in above ground biomass, and also in the soils. And so what we see here is that the primary forest and the regrowing forest contain more total carbon storage than these other ecosystems. The primary forest particularly so. And I think it's also important to point out, I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but a little bit about this, actually, I will, but that there's an immense amount of carbon below ground. We often think about, and partly because we can sort of see it, the carbon above ground, right? The carbon contained in the live vegetation above ground, but that's equal and sometimes greater in mass below ground, which I think is pretty amazing. So that's storage. That's the standing amount of carbon if we were to go out and measure it in a forest, for example, or in the courtyard or any ecosystem. I want to introduce the term sequestration, which can mean slightly different things depending on the context. Here we mean carbon, the rate of carbon uptake and allocation to biomass and soils by forest. So it's the rate rather than the standing crop or amount, which is storage. So I'm going to use those two terms today. I think we'll hear talks later about other alternatives to carbon sequestration. And again, those are also important, as you'll see, important considerations as we think about a portfolio of options. Forests, as you'll see, won't do it all. They do quite a bit, but certainly they're not going to clean up all of our carbon emissions. Forests are so important that if we look at the policy, international policy, the COP, so the UN Climate Change Conference, had a declaration on forests and land use that cites the importance of forests. And one of the reasons they cite forest conservation and land use as critical is, again, to combat carbon emissions and accumulation in the atmosphere. If that carbon is contained in biomass and it's locked away in biomass and soils, it means it's not out in the atmosphere serving as a greenhouse gas in the form of CO2. All right, so this is a little bit of background, sort of foundational material for the carbon cycle. When we think about, again, carbon cycling, that implies, and it is dynamic. Carbon moves into and out of ecosystems. And while this looks pretty complex, I'll break it down for you. Much of this you've probably learned, or various components at some point in school. So photosynthesis is the process that results in the fixation of carbon, the uptake of carbon, and the removal of carbon from the atmosphere. That carbon is then allocated to biomass in the form of leaves, roots, stems, trunk, wood. Some of that carbon sheds. So in deciduous systems, it sheds pretty regularly, right, on a predictable basis. And that's what this term here in litter fall. So we have a transfer of carbon from live into dead pools, right? So that's part of the cycle here. It's moved from the atmosphere into live biomass, but down now to the soil, where the microbes in particular, the microbial communities that are present, use that carbon, that dead carbon, necromass, sometimes we call it, or detritus, as an energy source. They decompose it, and in the process, they release carbon back to the atmosphere. And that's what this heterotrophic respiration term is. There's also what we call autotrophic respiration. That's plant respiration. Plants are autotrophs. And so the important point here is that there's carbon going in and there's carbon going out. And that balance of how much carbon is moving in and how much is moving out is sort of like the bottom line in your checkbook, right? You'd like to see a net gain, a net accumulation in your bank account, a net savings, which means there's a transfer, right? A net transfer from someplace else into your account. The same thing's true here when we think about carbon sequestration. We'd like to see that the balance is such that more carbon is moving in than is moving out through these pathways. This is a system that we study, a forest that we've been studying for about 20 years up in Michigan. And just to show you an example, it's real data. The amount of carbon allocated to roots in a year, this is sequestration, is quite high. So again, what's happening below ground is really important. When we think about what's present in terms of storage, if we were to go out and measure the amount of carbon in a standing stock, we'd see more accumulation, total accumulation in stems. And that's because the stems aren't shedding on an annual basis like the leaves. So that you're accumulating wood carbon over a longer period of time. And you can see in this forest, that amounts to about 100 metric tons of carbon per hectare, which is a substantial amount. So I want to start with some takeaways and then break these down individually for you. First message is that forests take up and store a lot of carbon, as you'll see, but not enough to fully stabilize atmospheric CO2. I'll put a number on that, but also appreciate that it's dynamic. It's not, I'll give you a fixed number, but it's not really fixed, as we'll see. Forest harvesting, disturbance, and climate change threaten the permanence of the forest carbon sink. So that's a large portion of what we do for research in my lab is think about disturbance, climate change, sometimes harvesting, and how that influences the carbon sink potentially. And then management, and I'll talk a little bit about the management policies that are needed to maximize and sustain forest carbon sequestration. So again, first point here, forests take up and store large amounts of carbon, but not enough to fully stabilize atmospheric CO2. The current number is that globally forests sequester about 21, so between 20 and 25% of our carbon emissions, or about 7.6 billion metric tons annually. So that's a substantial amount. And the 21 is a little bit deceiving because, again, this can be higher, could be lower. It could be eroded in the future with climate change and disturbance. We'll talk a little bit about that. It could be higher through perhaps additional management approaches that enhance carbon sequestration. So we'll talk about that. How do we measure carbon sequestration in forests and other ecosystems? We use a variety of different tools. These are pictures of students in my lab doing work at these various scales. So in our research group, we conduct carbon cycling research at multiple scales, and we quantify carbon sequestration at multiple scales. Sometimes that's with a tape measure here, or Lisa, who's in the back here, measuring the amount of carbon dioxide that's taken up by a leaf at the individual leaf level. But sometimes we're using airplanes and satellites, and in between, towers that are measuring more landscape scale carbon uptake. And the case I would make is that we need all of these tools for various reasons and for different reasons in some cases. This allows us to understand the mechanism and really the finer scale processes. What's happening here, sort of at the landscape scale with towers, allows us to see an ecosystem or landscape in aggregate. So a collection of trees, a whole forest landscape rather than an individual tree. And then of course we have a need, if we're thinking about particularly global processes here and how those global processes are in aggregate influencing the atmospheric CO2 concentration and changing climate, then we really need this larger scale perspective. So all of these tools are really critical to the work that we do. Much of the work that we do, or some of the work that we do, focuses on using meteorological flux towers. So there's actual partnership with engineers, atmospheric scientists, fluid mechanics, specialists in engineering, who figured out alongside ecologists that we could use this tool, again, to measure landscape scale. So on the order of several hectares, and sometimes even larger, maybe up to a square kilometer for a very tall tower, the carbon sequestration or the carbon uptake and loss from ecosystems. So this is our meteorological flux tower at the Rice Center. It's a short tower because it's positioned above a wetland that's only about 2 meters tall. So the tower height in part is determined by the stature of the vegetation, which in this case is of short stature. But these towers are distributed globally. There are some gaps for sure. There are some ecosystems that are not represented, but there are over 600 or so towers globally distributed across different ecosystems, not just forests. We here at VCU operate or co-operate 3, one at the Rice River Center and 2 at the University of Michigan Field Station. So these towers broadly distributed give us a really nice picture of this carbon exchange between the atmosphere and ecosystems on the ground. And I want us to watch this animation. I'll talk through it here. It's not my animation, it's NASA's, but it's produced from data like the flux towers, stitched together to give us some understanding of the spatial and temporal dynamic of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and how it's interacting with the biosphere, the forests and other ecosystems on the ground. You can see here, they've layered in, which I really like, these forests on the continents here. And so I'm gonna play this, and there we go. So what we see, if we look in the Northern Hemisphere and look at the timestamp down here, this is December, the Northern Hemisphere, we see reds and yellows, it's winter, and these reds and yellows tell us that there's an enrichment of carbon dioxide in the Northern Hemisphere. That's because in January, temperate forests particularly are not consuming carbon. In fact, they are emitting carbon to the atmosphere. Why? Because they don't have leaves, so they're not pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. We can see that signature and that influence on atmospheric CO2 as the Northern Hemisphere is rotating in our direction. And it's about peaking here in April. So that accumulation of CO2 in the Northern Hemisphere really high in April, May. And what we're going to see shortly is a transition to cooler temperature, or cooler colors rather, indicating a drawdown of CO2 in the Northern Hemisphere, which corresponds with green up of vegetation in the Northern Hemisphere. So as that green up occurs in the Northern Hemisphere, there's a drawdown of carbon dioxide, and again, a transfer, movement of carbon from the atmosphere into vegetation. So again, I think it's pretty remarkable that we can see this in these kinds of animations. And of course, there's a lot of variability spatially and temporally. So we can appreciate that certainly in the animation, but to put some data to it so we can observe what do the data actually tell us. Charles Keeling back in the 50s had this crazy idea to set up a flask sampling of CO2 on a volcano in Hawaii, Mauna Loa, and which produced arguably the most famous, or really not arguably even, the most famous record of carbon dioxide, atmospheric carbon dioxide, partly because it's continued for so long, since the late 50s to the present time. You could go to Mauna Loa, if you search Mauna Loa NOAA, and see what Mauna Loa is observing right now in terms of CO2. And what we see, a couple things we noticed. One is there's this overriding signature of increasing atmospheric CO2 over time, right? So the trend is obviously upward over time. But this annual cycle of up, down, up, down, up, down corresponds with that green up, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, and that leaf loss or dormancy period that influences how much carbon is being sequestered by forests seasonally. So you can see that signature, again, particularly the forests, because they're so dominant in the Northern Hemisphere, but also of other ecosystems, influencing the carbon cycle, seeing a low point during the year when we're at sort of peak carbon sequestration in the middle of summer, and then an enrichment during the dormant season, right? So that was something that, again, produced a really striking result at the time, because it was the first time back in the 50s we could measure these things, and that record continues to be really, really important. So I'm going to talk now about forest harvesting, disturbance, climate change, and how they may threaten the permanence of the forest carbon sink. And so here by permanence, I essentially mean the stability, right? So one of the things we'd like to see in carbon sequestration measures is that carbon is locked up with some degree of security, long-term, again, sort of permanence. And we know, though, from the flux towers that I mentioned, and the graphic is a little bit scrambled, but you could see it, is that this is annual carbon sequestration. This is supposed to be years. So this is almost a 20-year record of carbon sequestration from a meteorological tower supported for over 20 years by the Department of Energy. And we here at VCU co-manage this tower and the data record. We provide those data freely to ecologists, to meteorologists, to climate modelers, and it gets used quite a bit. I get a download every time our data are downloaded. I probably get 10 or 12 a day, global from around the world. But what this is showing, what it was supposed to show, is that carbon sequestration is up and down annually in this forest. So these are annual values. there's a lot of up and down. There's a lot of, in other words, interannual variability in the amount of carbon that is sequestered by this forest. And that tells us again that climate, other variables are influencing the amount of carbon that's sequestered by this forest. We know this was supposed to be 2010 here, and you can't unfortunately see the point, but the low point, there's a low point, I guess that's the low point, corresponds with insect defoliation, with leaf loss. And so a decline in carbon sequestration during that year. And so disturbance plays a really critical role in determining the rate of carbon accumulation in forests. Here's an example of a healthy forest. We might have 10 tons of carbon taken up through photosynthesis and 9 emitted through respiration, those processes that I talked about that result in the release. And in a healthy forest, that might mean, again, think of this as sort of like your bank account equivalent, an accumulation rate of 3 tons of carbon per hectare per year, which is pretty standard in a temperate forest. That's equivalent to about 2 vehicles, offsetting the emissions from driving 2 vehicles annually, the average driver. Some of you might say, I don't drive, right? You may drive more, but that's approximately what that is. So healthy forest, we know carbon sequestration is pretty reliably occurring. There's some variability, but disturbance enters the picture. And it's important to acknowledge this animation. It's showing us disturbance locations. But the other thing it's showing us is that it's dynamic, but it's just about everywhere. At some point, a forest will be disturbed. And there are implications for the carbon cycle when that forest is disturbed. That's something we study as a group. So for example, this is a wind disturbance picture I took up in Pennsylvania near Pittsburgh. We might see equal amounts of carbon going in and carbon going out, right? Well, why is that in this disturbance? Because one, we have fewer leaves and we have more dead material that can be decomposed by those microbes, which results in sort of these two things canceling out, this process of uptake and loss. And this ecosystem may be a net zero, right? Sort of not an emitter, not a sink. On the other hand, if we have a severe disturbance like this clear cut followed by fire, and fire certainly is occurring in many forests, more so in the West, we may have very minimal amounts of carbon being sequestered because we don't have a lot of vegetation here, but lots of carbon being emitted because this material is being rapidly decomposed by microbes. And in this case, the ecosystem is actually an emitter. It's losing carbon. So thinking about how do we manage forests for greater stability and long-term stability and carbon sequestration really requires that we understand how different kinds of disturbances influence the permanence, the long-term sort of sustainability of carbon sequestration. Temperature is also playing an important role. So temperatures we know global mean temperatures are increasing. There is some spatial variability, but we can see just about everywhere there's an increase in temperature from this map. And when we look at data, well, theoretical sort of principles and data, that suggests that we will see, and we really are seeing, an erosion of carbon sequestration because the loss of carbon is increasing at a rate that's faster than the accumulation. So theoretically, if you look at the left here, and this is work supported by the National Science Foundation in our group and elsewhere with other groups, say right now, if this is supposed to be temperature, and this is a photosynthesis curve. This is carbon sequestration, and this is loss respiration. So the loss curve and the gain curve. And what we notice here is that perhaps at current temperatures, the gains of carbon, the uptake is greater than the loss, right? But the challenge moving forward as we continue to see temperatures rise is that the uptake function and the release carbon function have different temperature response functions, different response surfaces. And if temperature increases too much, we'll see that the loss term is greater than the increase, and the ecosystem becomes an emitter. And we're starting to see that happen in some of the ecosystems that we've investigated This is one of the things about stick around long enough. It's a little scary, right? In real time, after 20 years, though, of real-time data collection, we are observing this. And in a paper that we published a few years ago, these slopes, which are the intercept is changing, the slope's not, but this upward increase in intercept is telling us that we're seeing globally in the data the emissions of carbon dioxide from ecosystems increasing as a result of increasing global mean temperatures. So that erosion is of CO2, of that carbon sink that has been so reliable, does appear to be happening. So briefly, just to close this out, talk a little bit about management and policies that are needed as we think about forest carbon sequestration. Right now, if you go to a company, a corporation, and you ask for them to offset your carbon emissions, much of their portfolio in terms of carbon offsets is associated with forestry and land use. So this is one example. And there's certainly a diversified portfolio, and there needs to be, because as I mentioned, forestry and forests will not do it all. But they're a substantial fraction. And this sort of, they fall within this category of what we call natural climate solutions or nature-based climate solutions. And if we look at the projections moving forward, the natural climate solutions continue to be an important part of this sort of portfolio of options moving forward. But as we discussed, there's volatility, right? There's potential, there certainly is variability in the capacity of forests to sequester carbon. So there's some considerations here. If you look at TerraPass, which has been around for a while, just as one example, they will offset your carbon footprint for flights. You can actually subscribe to a monthly subscription to offset your carbon footprint. So personal carbon offsets or corporate carbon offsets, which is happening. So corporations, I know, like Target, for example, and others, are interested in offsetting at least partially their carbon emissions. But then the question is, okay, so is it the case that they're able to sequester in a meaningful way our carbon emissions? How does that work? How should it work if we're considering using what we would call carbon credits to offset our carbon emissions partially or fully, right? So the concept of carbon crediting is that if I want to offset my carbon footprint, then I would purchase a carbon credit from somebody else who is offsetting carbon in some way, right? That could be through forest sequestration, or it could be through chemical sequestration, or there are various other ways and approaches, right? But that carbon crediting approach is happening mostly on a voluntary basis, not entirely voluntary. California has mandatory carbon markets, and certainly some other nations have required carbon markets. So for carbon markets, though, carbon credits to be meaningful, they need to be additional. They need to provide some additionality, meaning the carbon that's sequestered needs to be above and beyond sort of the ambient background sequestration. That's true of forests too, right? So it can't just be what forests are doing now to sequester carbon. It has to result in additional carbon sequestration. It has to be measurable. So something we can quantify, which may sound obvious, but it can be quite challenging to measure carbon sequestration without partners, without that expertise, right? They need to be verifiable and enforceable, and then they need to be permanent. So I'll run through these really quickly. Additionality, again, is this concept that you're adding more than what's already there to the storage of carbon. You're removing more carbon than what's occurring in the background. In forests, in forest management, that would mean, for example, restoring some lands back to forests. So maybe old agricultural lands that were depleted of carbon, regrowing forests in those areas, managing for greater carbon sequestration, which is also possible. And then restoration projects. So this is the restoration, this is the protection. So that is, if we do those things, some estimates say we could increase our current rates of carbon sequestration in forests or nature-based solutions, I guess, as a whole, by about 70%. We also have to be able to measure these things. And again, it's pretty challenging to measure these things in the real world because these are not tools necessarily that the public uses at the moment, right? They're not off-the-shelf tools. If you want to offset your carbon footprint from the forest in your backyard, you're probably going to have to hire some specialists to do some of these measurements. And in fact, even at the international level, most of this paper is suggesting that most of the nations that suggest they would like to use forest carbon sequestration as a way to offset their carbon emissions don't really have a plan for quantifying those carbon emissions. So that's that carbon uptake. So that's a problem. That's a challenge. It needs to be verifiable and enforceable. There's been a lot of press about the verifying and enforcing these carbon credits right now. This means different things. It's not necessarily standardized across the industry. Should it be? I'm not a policy expert, but some would argue it should be, or we should at least understand what is being sequestered, what counts as sequestered carbon, and how do we verify that? And then again, how do we deal with this issue of permanence when these are dynamic systems that are not always not always sequesters of carbon. Sometimes they're actually emitters. How do we deal with that issue of, for example, fire increasing on this landscape? Should we then allow these ecosystems to participate in carbon sequestration efforts, or do we discount those altogether, knowing that they're more vulnerable? Those are challenging questions. So I think the last slide here, just what the ISEE and other interdisciplinary institutes can offer is this interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary perspective, right? It requires truly an interdisciplinary approach to resolve it, not just resolve the issue, but to make real change on the ground, to implement it. I'm in my office most of the time looking at, carbon sequestration data, but how do I communicate those data to someone in a meaningful way to stakeholders? So we need engineers, biologists, policy specialists, and economists all in the same place, working together. The DOE talk yesterday mentioned, for example, there are opportunities for funding that engage these various specialists. These are challenging proposals in my experience to write, but they're important, right? So I'll leave it with that. And I don't think we have much time for questions, but okay. A couple questions.
That's a wonderful topic, and we have plenty of time and break, so we can cut a little bit in the break. So questions for Chris? Let's get over there.
I came in when you were talking about Mauna Loa. How big island is right now?
Because of Zoom, people cannot hear, so let's get microphone.
Oh, right.
And just say your name and affiliation, and then the question.
Pat Cummins, School of World Studies. But I wanted to ask you about Mauna Loa. I came in just as you were talking about it.
Yeah.
They had some volcanic action in Hawaii very recently. Have the biologists been looking at measuring all of these questions in relation to what's done to carbon emissions with volcanoes and so on?
Yes. It's a little bit outside of my expertise, but when we think about climate forcing, volcanic activity is an important consideration. It does not have as much of a footprint globally on the atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations as, say, forests and other geologic processes, arguably. But it does have an effect. And in fact, volcanoes are sort of interesting because they can emit both gases that cool the atmosphere and warm. So that balance, not a volcanologist, but that balance is also something that climate scientists consider.
And then something you did touch on when I was working in Costa Rica. Actually, at the time, I was helping the Lake Erie Center with the University of Toledo, and we were looking at their policies. This was in the late 90s. They were doing something that you talked about, and I don't know if they're measuring it well, but every time someone would do something that would increase our carbon footprint, they would charge them money so that it could go and get cleaned up.
Carbon tax.
So are we thinking of doing something like that in the United States, or are ecologists out there trying to advocate to make that happen?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a complicated question. I can't do it justice in the short time I have, but yes, there are places, again, California has a mandatory cap. And so there are places where there's mandatory markets, there are voluntary markets as well that exist. It's likely the case that at some point we'll move in the direction of mandatory carbon markets and a cap and trade system. But of course, that's becomes a political issue. It has been a political issue in some places and contexts. So I can't predict the future, but it does seem like there've been ups and downs over the years.
Are the ecologists advocating? Like you belong to groups that advocate to do it?
I would say on balance, for sure, ecologists or scientists are advocating for, yes, for regulation and some sort of cap.
You're quick.
Hi, Ivy Main, I'm the Sierra Club Renewable Energy co-chair.
Yeah.
So in Virginia, there is a good deal of silviculture, of forest managed to be cut down. And so that you can either leave the branches that aren't useful for forestry on the ground, or take them and burn them for energy. And setting aside the issues of pollution and the burning of them, does it matter to the forest cycle whether you leave those branches there or take them away?
Yes.
What happens to the carbon cycle there?
Yeah. So in 30 seconds, I'll try to distill this. It does matter because you're not only removing carbon when you remove branches from the forest floor. So what you're describing is it's much easier for industrial foresters to delimb, to remove a whole tree and delimb in one location. And what you end up with is a big pile of detritus that's been removed. That removal of carbon and biomass is also associated with the removal of nutrients. And so there are a number of studies that show when you remove those nutrients, you pile them up in one place, that's not resulting in sustainable forestry. And so what that means is we end up dumping a lot of chemical fertilizer on our industrially managed forests. And of course, chemical fertilizer, we did a full life cycle analysis, huge amount of carbon invested in producing chemical fertilizer. So best practices would be to redistribute that material on the site or just leave it there in the first place.
Yeah, Jagjit Nanda from Slack in Stanford. So great talk. My question is a little more general. So you saw the net carbon uptake and emission in a forest ecosystem. By any chance, you have the split ratio of how much is CO2 versus methane? Because methane can be also produced locally because of grasslands and a lot of veterinary activities and all those animals and others. Do you have that split things? Because this
yeah, that's a good question. Not for our forested systems. Generally, the methane signal in forests is pretty minimal. It's not zero, but it's really, really minimal. Now wetlands, when you think about wetlands, and we do work in forested wetlands, and Scott Neubauer over here is really the expert in methane. But yeah, sure. In that case, then that to some extent, the climate forcing associated with methane emissions is greater than that of the CO2 uptake. So you have to consider both of those things in a forested wetland: the uptake of CO2, but also the emissions, the net emissions of methane. Yeah.
All right, let's thank Chris one more time. Our next contribution is from MIT, and Professor Ellen Hatton, who is in the Department of Chemical Engineering, is here to talk about electrochemical based CO2 separation.
Well, thanks, Rem, and thanks, Peru, for the invitation to be here today. What I'd like to do today is, we've heard a lot about the natural ways of being able to sequester CO2. I want to look at the, I suppose, unnatural ways in which we actually have a human intervention and do a natural collection of CO2. And in particular, I want to look at a new approach that we've been looking at in terms of the energetic sources, the energy sources for doing the CO2 capture and release, and then, of course, subsequent sequestration. So we all recognize there's been a major change, particularly over the last 5 decades or so, in the global temperatures, around about 1.5, almost 1.5 degrees Celsius by now. And this, of course, has been responsible for a large number of different climatic changes that are getting more and more catastrophic as the years go by. It's been associated with the whole idea that we have the fact that the temperature rise is directly correlated with the cumulative CO2 emissions. And basically, if we continue accumulating CO2 as we've been doing, by the mid-50s, mid-century, we'll be around about 2.5 degrees temperature rise and continuing to rise. So we do need to think of ways in which we can abate this. And so this is one of the things I'm going to be talking about today. In particular, we're going to start thinking about the carbon dioxide balance. And we heard a little bit of that today in terms of the natural uses. But if you think about the overall carbon balance, what we have is about 35 gigatons per year. In the last decade or so have been due to fossil fuels and industrial combustion operations. And some of the is also from land use change. We've got another 4 gigatons per year, which means we've got close to about 40 gigatons per year of carbon dioxide that's ending up in the atmosphere. That's being emitted to the atmosphere. Of this, some of it is, as we heard earlier, is absorbed by land sinks, by vegetation, by natural sources. But there's also a rather large group in terms of the ocean as well. The ocean is absorbing around about 1/4 of the total CO2 that's been emitted is now being reabsorbed by the ocean. So we get a total amount around about 22 gigatons per year of total sinks of the CO2, which still leaves us in our bank balance, to use the analogy earlier, of about 20 gigatons per year in this case. So this is a real big issue, of course, and this is accumulating on an annual basis, and that's why we're seeing the continued increase in the CO2 capture. There is, of course, a need for mitigating these effects. And in fact, if this is an old slide that says, if we continue business as usual with certain greenhouse gas emissions as a function of time, by the turn of the century, if we continue business as usual, of course, we'll have temperature rises greater than 4 degrees Celsius, which would be unsustainable for our lifestyles. Which means that we really need to think about how we can keep the temperature rise to be less than 2 degrees Celsius, which means that we have to really have some intervention right now to be able to mitigate some of these greenhouse gas emissions. And this is what we should be doing. Now, what you'll see at some point, we've actually got to get a point where we start having negative emissions, in which case we have to start removing the CO2 that's already been accumulating in the environment. In other words, we have to atone for our past sins in this regard. Now, mitigation, of course, can come about because transitioning to non-carbon sources, so we can mitigate a lot of these emissions by having non-carbon sources, nuclear, renewable energy, et cetera, but also is going to be a really significant component. It's going to be looking at capture, utilization, and storage, because we are not going to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels for a long time. So we need to think about how do we remove CO2 from stationary CO2 emitters in a very effective and efficient way. And we also need removal technology with permanent storage is going to be needed. But in addition, there are going to be certain unavoidable greenhouse gas emissions that we are not going to be able to mitigate using these kind of standard procedures, and which means we're going to have to start thinking a little bit more aggressively about how we go about doing a net negative greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, removing the CO2 from the environment where it's already been accumulating. And this, of course, is direct air and ocean capture of some of the topics, bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration, afforestation, and of course, this is something we just heard about a little while ago. So if we think about the overall carbon dioxide removal, what are the challenges? Well, if you look at point source capture, the typical concentrations for CO2 on the order of 4 to 20%, which means it's a fairly decent driving force, a large enough concentration that you should be able to get fairly good capture of the CO2 if you use appropriate chemical agents. If you look in the atmosphere, however, it's many orders of magnitude smaller. The concentrations are much lower, which provides a much more difficult task, particularly from a thermodynamic and a mass transfer rate point of view. And then in addition to that, we have direct ocean capture. Where most of the CO2 is essentially in the form of dissolved inorganic carbon. And the dissolved inorganic carbon will be primarily bicarbonates and carbonates in the system. But this is accumulating there. And the problem we have is that as the CO2 is accumulating in the ocean, it's leading to some acidification, which is detrimental to marine life and so on. So we do need to think about ways in which we can modulate again the amount of CO2 or carbon that's in the oceans. So the traditional modes of CO2 capture and release, there are two primary modes, the other ways as well, but these are the two most studied ones, adsorption and adsorption. Adsorption, what we have is a continuous flow of some kind of a chemical agent, and the chemical agent will react, as the base will react with the CO2 to form some kind of a complex. And that's how it occurs in the absorber. So you can take a dilute stream and you can capture CO2 as shown here. Then this particular solution is taken to a desorber where we put a lot of energy in there and to break this chemical bond. And so we then release CO2, and you can release CO2 essentially as a pure CO2 stream. So it's a very strong uphill thing, taking low concentration CO2 and capturing it as high concentration CO2, pure CO2, which can then be compressed and sequestered, for instance, in the subsurface geologic domains, things like that. The other approach is using adsorption, which this would be a packed bed of solid particles. CO2 absorbs on the particles. At some point, the particles get saturated with CO2. You take it offline, and you then heat it up to drive off the CO2, and then cool it down again and recycle it. So there are a number of different sorbents that can be used. This just gives you a complete list. I'm not going to go into details on them. The important part to recognize here is that the temperature ranges over which they work on the order of 25 to 200 degrees Celsius primarily, although there are some that operate at very high temperatures too. But the important part is here is the strength of interaction of these different sorbents for this chemical reaction is going to be an important consideration too, because the amount of energy that you have to put in to break this chemical bond is basically related to the strength of interaction. So the stronger the interaction, the more energy you're going to have to put into that bond as well. The problem with these kind of things, well, I should point out that amines are the typical ones that have been used most widely in these kind of processes. But these all require temperature swings of about 50 to 100 degrees Celsius to reverse this chemical reaction, which means we have to have certain degree high energy thermal sources. We have to think about heat integration to optimize the overall performance of the systems. And we also have the problem that when you're heating things, you're not just heating up that reagent, you're also heating up all the solvent and all the other materials that are in that area. So that's somewhat inefficient as well. So some of the point source capture power plants has actually been done. This is showing the absorbers at Petronova and at Boundary Dam. These are the regenerators. These are the thermal regenerators over there. And you can see they're pretty large. The typical capture rates and the amounts they've been capturing have been a reasonable amount at this point. The thing is, the regeneration temperature is about 120 degrees. You normally capture at about 40 degrees, have to regenerate at 120 degrees. That's a lot of heating that's needed. On direct air capture, some other things. This is because you've got much lower concentration, we have to treat a lot more air to be able to capture the same amount of CO2. And you can see this is basically a plant that Climeworks is set up in Iceland. It captures about 4,000 tons a year. And this is a conceptual idea for another company, Carbon Engineering. But you can see very, very large units that are required to capture a small amount of CO2. And typically regeneration temperatures here, they're heating up to 900 degrees because they're a specific process. And here we've got temperatures around 80 to 100 degrees in this particular case. So our thought is, can we get around this problem? Can we get over this problem of requiring these high energy sources? And so we thought we'd look at redox chemical processes or electrochemical processes in which we capture and release CO2 by regulating the oxidation state of a redox active species. It's a species that can be either reduced or oxidized depending on the applied potential, applied voltage to the system. And this is going to be governed by the so-called Nernst equation. The Nernst equation basically says that the amount of reduced component relative to the oxidized component is directly related to the applied voltage, applied potential relative to some standard potential. And then you've got the other terms in there as well. But this showed that the actual applied potential you apply to the electrode or to the compound will determine the amount of reduced compound that you have. And what this says is that if you look at the fraction of compound that's reduced as a function of the applied potential, you'll get a curve that looks something like this. Okay. And what this says is if you're very sufficiently negative potential relative to this E naught, what you've got then is a very high activation of this compound. And that's when you can actually get your sorption and complexation with the CO2. Now, what happens when you go, if you want to now take this and release the CO2, what we do, of course, is just apply a more positive potential, break that oxidize the material and release the CO2 in this particular case. And so the nice part about this is that the energy as well that we're using targets only the sorbent molecules. It does not target the whole volume of everything, all the water phase, or whatever else it is in this particular case. So if we look at this, then basically we can say these processes, they really can be modular, which is really nice. They can be compact. They can be isothermal, which I think could be a big advantage of these systems. They can be plug and play. You don't need external thermal sources or anything like that. We can just, as long as we've got a decent electrical source, we can use these, and they can be driven by renewable energy if desired. So let me show you a couple of examples of how this kind of a process would work. This would be for point source type capture, in which we have a gas absorption column. We have a flue gas coming in. We have an amine, as shown here, coming in at the top. And when it reacts with the CO2 in the absorption column, you form the so-called carbamate. This carbamate, normally we would use a thermal means to heat this up again to drive off the CO2. But we're not going to do that here. What we do is we take that stream and send it to the anode chamber, where we oxidize a copper electrode of an electrochemical cell. So in this chamber here, what we're doing is we're applying a voltage and we're releasing copper ions. We're dissolving copper ions under the appropriate voltage. This will then interact very strongly with these amines and displace the CO2. So CO2 comes off as a pure CO2 stream. And then once we've done that, we can remove the CO2 here and we're left with the amine copper complex that needs to be taken to the second stage of the cell, in which we then go and go through the reduction, remove the copper and recycle the amine. So we've got a complete electrochemical cycle now, as opposed to the thermal cycle that we had before. So this is a plug and play, and it's an isothermal process. So that's really advantageous. This is basically the kind of system that we looked at, just to show that we actually did the experiments at a reasonable scale. And if you look at the results, what you find is by applying the current to the system, about half an amp, the cell potential around about half a volt, which is actually very, very good for energetically. And the gas output is very close. We can actually release CO2 very, very efficiently. And the CO2 we released is around 100% CO2 in this particular case. So this showed that this process is viable. It does work. The question is it economical? And from some very stringent techno-economic analysis, we looked at the energetics of the process. And this is what we get in terms of our overall EMAR process, as we call it right now. And you can see the energetics are comparable to what the traditional means are for the CO2 capture, but we do have the advantage of the other the compactness, modularity, et cetera, in these systems. There are some over potentials that are required. You have to apply a much stronger potential than you would like from a minimum perspective. And that's normal thermodynamic constraints and transport constraints. And there are various ways in which we can optimize these. In fact, we've done something since then. We've reduced this particular, but here by about 20–30% by adding surfactants to the system. But just show that this kind of approach has some potential for doing the separations. But that's not the only way we can do this. There are other redox active species in which we get a more direct interaction in the system. And for instance, we have these things called quinones, as shown here. This is a benzoquinone. It's not the best one to use, but it's good for the illustration here. If you have a quinone by itself, it does not interact with the CO2 at all. It's uninterested in the CO2. But if we now come through this particular state, we've got the dormant state here. If we now reduce it by adding the electrons to it, we get a very strong electron and concentration on the oxygens here. It makes it very, very nucleophilic. It will then capture the CO2 to form a compound like this. So this is the way we capture the CO2. And then when you want to release the CO2 again, we just go through the reverse process, oxidize, remove those electrons, take it back to the neutral state. It doesn't care for the CO2 at all, kicks off the CO2, and we can then capture the CO2, release the CO2 as a pure stream. So we've done some work. There are a number of different ways we can do it. We can do flow systems, we can do static heterogeneous, which I'll be talking about, and other kinds of other systems as well. But I won't talk about these as much. I'm going to talk about this particular one here right now. The idea, again, is that we have a quinone, this is a naphtha quinone in this particular case, being reduced, capturing the CO2, and then going through the reverse cycle and releasing the CO2. The question is, where do you get these electrons from? But it depends on how we set it up. In one particular case, we have a counter-electron system in which we have a ferrocene, which will then be oxidized to give ferrocenium and can be reduced. So this is really just like an electron sink and source. That's the only purpose in life at this particular point. So the way in which we do this is we take these quinones and we immobilize them on an electrode, put them on the electrode, and same with the ferrocenes. So just like two electrodes of a battery, basically. And then we have a spacer in between to prevent short circuiting and the like. And we then wet everything with some kind of an electrolyte to allow for current flow and so on. So we've got an ionic electrolyte, which is non-volatile. That's important. It provides us really good system. This to show you the kind of structure. I'm not going to go into discussion on that. We can talk about that if anybody's interested. So how do we actually operate this system? Well, if we take our sandwich as shown here with the quinones and the ferrocenes, and we apply a voltage across there, what's going to happen, of course, we then get this is going to be reduced and it's going to be oxidized. We have a feed gas coming in, the CO2, and during this reduction process here, we actually then can capture the CO2, immobilize the CO2 on the adsorbent. This case. And the same token, of course, the ferrocene is giving up the electrons to supply them for the reduction of the quinones. When we've fully loaded the system, we can just reverse the polarity and have a sweep stream. And what we do again is reverse it. We now oxidize this compound. It doesn't just release the CO2 that can be swept away in the sweep stream. And then, of course, the ferrocenium is back to the ferrocene in this particular case. So just to show you how this works, this is basically a case in which we had a stack of these electrochemical cells, and you can see that's what they would look like. We think they look like, as shown here. And what you've got is a feed of CO2, rich feed, to this stack of cells. And what will happen is, as we apply the reducing potential, what's going to happen is that the CO2 is going to be absorbed. Okay, so it comes in, it gets picked up, and so it gets depleted. The gas gets depleted of CO2. And at some point, this part here gets saturated, so you've got to move further and further in before you start absorbing CO2. And so it takes a certain amount of time before the whole bed is saturated, at which point you begin to see what's known as a breakthrough, and CO2 starts coming out of the bed. So this is a normalized concentration, the outlet concentration of the inlet concentration as a function of really time. And you can see eventually, let's say this case here, we're removing all the CO2 for a certain period of time until we saturate the bed, and then we get so-called breakthrough. And that's basically the way it operates. Does it operate in a cyclic fashion, in a well-regulated fashion? This is performance from a company that we formed, Verdox, that's looking at this, and just gives you one example of how it operates. Here's the outlet concentration of CO2 from that bed as a function of time. And what we've got is about 500 ppm, so close to ambient air conditions. And what you got during the adsorption process, you see we get a reduction in the CO2 coming out. And then when we switch the potential, we can actually get a desorption, and you get CO2 concentration leaving, goes up dramatically because we're releasing CO2 into that stream. And we can do that many, many cycles. And indeed, if we look at the number of cycles we have in the system, You're talking about this case, 215,000 cycles. They've gone up to well over 250,000 cycles now, with no more than about a 20% fade in overall performance, which is a really, really remarkable achievement in that case. The economics of it, they reckon, and this is projections, that we should be able to get by with around about, say, 2 gigajoules per ton of CO2 in the system, which is a really acceptable number, and a total cost, let's say, for $80 per ton. I'm always suspicious of the low values of these systems. And so I'd just like to point out that Verdox we formed about 3.5 years ago, and it was one of the winners of the X Prize Carbon Removal Award last year. So it does show that there's some viability to this technology. But that's not the only way that we can do it. There are other things as well. We can think about having aqueous solutions. If we have an aqueous solution and you've got an alkaline solution, the CO2 being absorbed can then be absorbed to form the bicarbonate. It's just very, very quickly. I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but this is the basic description. So we thought about, well, other people have done it as well, but we're looking at a specific kind of molecule here, and that's so-called neutral red. That when we go through and we do a reduction, adding electrons to the system, and the presence of water, of course, what we find is that you do reduce it, we protonate these nitrogens here, and no one, and in so doing, we release the hydroxyl ions. So we've now got a high pH system, which means that when we expose it to CO2, what we'll get is the CO2 being picked up to form the bicarbonate. So we're absorbing CO2 as a bicarbonate in the system. And what we want to do now, of course, is take this solution and release that CO2, and we can release that by going through the oxidation and removing the electrons and releasing the CO2 to regenerate the neutral red dye. And we can go through the cycle continuously. And indeed, this is what we've done. This is one example of how we do this. This is an electrochemical cell. This is the two electrodes. This is the cathode, and this is the anode. What we've got here, this is a membrane separator, so we don't get mixing between the two streams. What we've got is that neutral red dye comes in, we reduce it, we get the reduced neutral red and the hydroxyl ions coming through. They come here and they get challenged with an airstream. When you challenge the airstream, what we do is we actually get CO2 absorbed, and so we get this neutral red, reduced neutral red, plus bicarbonate that's formed in the system. We take that to the other chamber in this electrochemical cell, where we now go through the oxidation process. And we remove those electrons. You can remove the electrons. And what we get then is that the CO2 is now released, and we can flash that off in a tank, as shown here. This neutral red has now been regenerated, and it can be taken back again to that system. Right. So we can do this kind of a process. And it's been very effective, actually. This is what it looks like. What we've got here is challenged with 15% CO2. And this is the time. This is the total cumulative amount of CO2 that we release. So we start out with CO2, and then we actually begin the cycle, and we just accumulate CO2 that's being released in the system. So over 12 hours, you can see it's pretty remarkable. It's pretty constant here. But I think what's really more remarkable here is that we have in direct contact with ambient air, just the laboratory air. Okay, and so what you've got here, the CO2 released is a function of time over 96 hours in this particular case, and it continues like this, very continuously. Now, this what's limiting the rate at which we can actually capture and release the CO2 is that absorption system, which is very inefficient. And so what we really need is a much more efficient absorption system there. So how do we go about doing this? Well, I think what we've got to think about is, particularly for direct air capture, you saw us showed earlier, these Climeworks and Carbon Engineering had those vast, huge fans and contacting units. We're going to have to do the same. There's no getting around that. But the important part here is, rather than capturing CO2 in those units and then heating up all those units to release the CO2 again, what we can do with our kind of system is actually have some units here in which we we have the reduced reagent, we flow it through these units, capture CO2, and then feed it back to a regeneration unit here. So what you've got a very distributed capture of over hundreds of meters. And what we can do here is then capture everything, take these solids and take it to a more centralized release unit where we can release CO2 as a concentrated stream using these electrochemical means. Could also use thermal means if you wanted to, but electrochemical is going to be much better. And so if you look at a capture rate of about 500 kilotons per year, which is a typical size that people are interested in terms of these direct air capture systems, we're talking about in the order of, say, 4 gigajoules per ton, which means about 60 megawatts continual power. We hopefully cost $100 to $400 a ton. Let's see if we can achieve that. And the question is, how do we go about supplying the energy for that? Well, if you think about the energy, we're talking about 5 to 10 acres per megawatt. So we're talking about 600 acres, really, for solar, just for the solar cells. And we're talking about even more, a lot more, 10 times that for wind towers, wind farms, and things like that. So there are constraints. We need a large land area for these renewable resources, but there's also the intermittency requirements. And do we require battery arrays to try and even out those? Should be connected to the grid at all for all of this? And what happens when you're using nuclear batteries or small nuclear reactors? You can get about 5 megawatts per acre, which is a lot more feasible in terms of, a lot more attractive in terms of land usage. But those are just some of the things we've got. How much, about 5 minutes? Okay. So I just want to go very quickly and finish up and discuss the other issue that we've talked about in point source capture. We've talked about direct air capture. What about the oceans? Now we know that basically we've got the oceans. A lot of CO2 has been taken up by the oceans. And the concentration, actually, it's interesting. If you think about the 415, it's about 0.77 megs per mil. Whereas in the oceans, we're close to 100 milligrams per liter. So the actual concentration in the oceans is around about 140 times more than in the air, which means you have to process a lot less fluid. Of course, you can process liquid as opposed to gas. So, but there are some issues there. And are there some opportunities for doing capture from the oceans? Why do we want to do this? Of course, the ocean the capture of CO2 by the ocean is leading to acidification and some changes in the pH over time. And this, of course, has led to disruption of coral reefs and other marine life and so on. The interesting thing here is that if we've got the CO2, we've got the bicarbonate here that's been formed when we do this. If we want to release the CO2, what we really need to do is push this bicarbonate back to the carbon dioxide. And to do that, we've got to add protons to push it this way. So we want to go from this region here to more basic, more acidic type pHs in this case. So how do we go about doing that? Well, there are a number of ways we can do that. We're looking at a treatment of ocean water in which we'd have ocean water coming in. You send it to electrochemical cell. This is very different from what other people are doing, in which we have electrodes and we apply an oxidizing potential. We can release protons into the water. And release protons, what we do is drive it to the CO2. Then the CO2 is now in molecular form. It can be pulled off. And the CO2 comes off. Then we can take those that acidified solution and take it back to the another set of cells where we recapture those protons and send the alkalized water back to the ocean. Now, there are certain issues here we won't have time to discuss, but I just want to point out this is one particular idea that one has on how to do this, in which case you could capture the CO2 and inject it at depth in sub-ocean. This has no membranes, no chemicals, and low voltages, which is some advantages over the other approaches people are looking at, we think. We've done this using bismuth electrodes, in which we go from bismuth to bismuth oxychloride and back again in this whole system. And what we find is as we apply more charge, we then convert the bicarbonate or carbonate into CO2, which can then be pulled off in the system. The actual voltages we want, I'm not going to go into detail on this, but we've got the voltage for the oxidizing and the reducing cells. And the swing there is only about 0.6 volts, which is actually a very low number And it really provides some very advantageous energetics for the system overall. And the pH swing, you can see the alkalized pH in this case is a little high, and the pH in the acidified water is shown here. But it does show that we are able to do this. We did it over 10 cycles over 10 hours or so. And just to show you that it works, we're able to release CO2 in a continuous fashion and quite effectively with reasonable energetics, at least at this point. It's probably the best energetics being reported for ocean capture. But of course, we work at low current densities and things like that. So I'd like to say that that just gives an idea of where we are. Now the question is, what do we do? Okay, we've captured CO2. What do we do with the CO2? This is actually a political cartoon. I just took out some political connotations of this and just quantified it. So we've got various sources for CO2, and we can then, once you've captured it, it can be used for directly for yield boosting, for as solvents, heat transfer fluids, and others. And these are fairly low volume uses in general. Or we can actually think about conversion, taking the CO2, converting it to fuels, chemicals, or building materials. But even that's not going to be enough to utilize all the CO2 we've got. And so if you try to use all the CO2, we'd more than saturate the markets. So there is going to be a need for a deep saline storage and things like that as well, and various other ways of storage in these systems. So with that, I'd like to finish up and say, I think that there is a role for electrochemically modulated CO2 capture. These guys can play a role in mitigating CO2 emissions. They can be isothermal, plug and play, modular. They have favorable energetics, and we can use non-carbon energy sources for these. They can be applicable across multiple scales and concentrations. We can talk about power generation, various industries. You can think about using them in mobile sources like trucks, ships, trains, and cars. Indoor environments, treating in their air here so we can minimize the air exchanges and air conditioning unit. You can think about direct air capture, direct ocean removal. There are engineering challenges, of course, bubble management, sensitive to oxygen, and coupling with renewable resources. But I think what's really important to think about as well is when you do this, is how much electricity are we going to need for such a system? And this is from a review article that I think Mim Rahimi put together, and Better Gallant, my colleague, and I'm just a guest author on this, but he was a postdoc with me. And so if you look at the total electricity generated as predicted over the decades and the actual where the electricity is coming from, various sources here, the important point is if we actually used electricity to convert the CO2 to chemicals, we'd use a significant fraction of electricity that's been generated just for the chemical conversion and electrical chemical conversion. If you look at the electricity for carbon capture, we're talking here in the order of about 1 petawatt hour, say by 2030, which is around about 3% of the total amount of electrical generation. So if all the carbon capture, 10 gigatons per year, whatever, is captured using electrical sources, you're going to be using a significant fraction of the world's electrical supply. So I'd like to thank the people who've done a lot of this work and the sponsors for the research. Thanks for your time, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Question for Alan?
Is there an optimum, I speak loud.
Okay.
Is there an optimum binding energy of CO2 for either capture or sequestration?
You certainly want to bring it down as low as you can in this particular case. Of course, it depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking at direct air capture, you need a stronger binding energy because you've got less of a driving force for the capture.
So if it's very low, then it will.
If you're very low, then you're not going to be able to capture anything. That's the issue. Yes. Yeah. So.
Yeah.
All right, Nanda.
Jagjit Nanda from SLAC and Stanford, being a redox flow battery and working on aqueous and non-aqueous electrolytes for a long time, we are delving into it and doing works. So I have enjoyed your talk. So regarding your quinones and those chemistry in your lab, what's the typical solubility of CO2 you have achieved for first stage before you release it. I assume it's aqueous.
No, it actually depends.
Yeah.
Primarily, we've been using organic solvents, and in particular, ionic liquids. So we actually, they get the complexation of the CO2 with the quinones.
Right,
Okay.
right.
So your efficiency depends on what your concentration of the quinones is. 100 millimolar, 500 millimolar.
And it's acetonitrile or?
We've used acetonitrile before, yes. You can use acetonitrile, we've used DMSO and the like. But we have to have other electrolyte components added to that too.
Do you have a corresponding pKa values for all those things corresponds to a pH values equivalent in aqueous?
They are, we do have those.
Like
values
Meyer
are
has done?
available.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
I should point out in aqueous type systems, you don't form those complexes.
Right.
In aqueous system, when you reduce the quinones, they become protonated from the
Right.
hydroquinone.
Yeah.
Right. And what that does, of course, is increase the pH.
Right.
So it's the other mechanism I talked about when you've got the CO2 absorption and form the bicarb.
Yeah, so I'm glad that you are using non-aqueous things, which is much higher CO2 solubility in principle.
Right.
In principle, it's pretty good. And but the challenge is there is you need to still reduce the over potential in terms of using a proton coupled electron transfer, similar to what Meyer has done. You have to find an electron injector and a hole injector that overall for the conversion, not for capture,
Right.
stories there. But so that's great. We can talk offline, and this is interesting direction. A lot of electrochemists are coming into. I have a question. When I talk to direct air capture to my industry colleagues, they laugh at it. They say that it's interesting science, and Jagjit, you can keep on doing your physical chemistry approaches, but it will never achieve the cost and scale. So DAC is pretty much a science exercise right now. What do you think about it?
Well, I think we have to think about what we mean by cost. Without direct air capture, we're never going to achieve our goals of getting the CO2 limited, right? So we've got to think about the societal cost as well, not just the economic cost. So I think that's going to be the important
But
issue.
they have monetized, they have to.
But the monetization is basically based on how much of an impact does it have on society as well in the long term. What's it going to be? That's a good question. Yeah.
Well, let's continue that during our break. This will be very lively conversation. And let's thank Alan one more time. Our next contribution is from Winning Wang, who is a faculty member in mechanical engineering right here at VCU. And he will also tell us about the, how to design a reasonably efficient CO2 capture technology. By the way, Winning really became quite famous during COVID because he designed this, the mask that was self-cleaning, where the coronavirus actually would be self-neutralized in the mask itself. So,
okay, thank you, Ram, for a nice introduction. Good morning, everyone. So I will continue the talk in the CO2. Because this is very essential and a very difficult issue to deal with. So since the CO2 capture already discussed by the previous speakers, I will just try to be brief and focus on the conversion. Try to see if we can do something, try to convert the CO2 into something useful. But this is very challenging work because CO2 is very stable. It's inert molecules. How to convert this one into different chemicals is a very critical challenge. So that's why we are still, we still have a long way to go, but we are doing something. Try to see if we can overcome this. Okay, so I will still look into this, a figure. So probably you have seen this for many times. But what I want to highlight here is that the CO2 emissions are real, right? So because this data obtained from the Hawaii is a real data. So that's why we really need to take this into serious consideration. So this is also the reason why there's increasing research activity in this area. People are looking into different ways to resolve CO2. And as also, if we look back, if we go back to the first talk, right? So Chris gave a very nice talk into the forest capture of the CO2. So nature actually does this. Right? Does this through photosynthesis. Right? So if we look back, revisit our middle school chemistry. Actually, my daughter is now learning the photosynthesis. Actually last week she told me. So we had a quiz in the middle school, science class, photosynthesis. I'm just very surprised to learn this term because I revisited this. You will see in natural, and especially the CO2 and water will be converted in the so-called chloroplast. Right? So this is plant cell into sugar and oxygen. Right? So if we see this overall reaction, so we have 6 molecules react with the water, of course, activated by the sunlight to get a 1 glucose and 6 oxygen. So this is a magic, equation, and nature does. And so this is also the foundation of many the so-called online calculators, right? So many, I think, people, especially my daughter, is now using this so-called the CO2 capture calculator to estimate how much the CO2 can be captured by trees. And so of course, this depends on different parameters, but this is an interesting tool based on the magic equation or the chemical reactions developed by nature to inspire people to resolve this issue. So this also is a very interesting but a complex the question saying, can planting trees resolve the CO2 issues, right? So obviously, the answer is not simple. So technically, it's possible, right? So the multi-university study showed that 2/3 of the total carbon emissions, can be removed, but practically very challenging because a lot of issues arise, right? So for example, the land use, right? So you need a lot of land, right? So on the other side, the people are removing trees, right? So especially in my neighborhood, I see the trees are moved, right? So urbanization, right? People need the house, right? So that's why they remove trees. So that's also another different opposite direction people are working on this. So that's makes things even complicated. And last but not least, the overall energy efficiency of photosynthesis is actually very low, less than 1%, surprisingly low. So the reason is because the plant is not only want to convert CO2, but also it will need to grow, adaptation, and also the reproduction. So a lot of competing process limit this overall efficiency of the solar utilization. So that's why, but I'm not going to talk to this a lot. So the nature is, develop beautiful chemistry to resolve this issue, but still not enough. We want to, as the engineer, as the scientist, we want to develop some kind of other approach to solve this issue, right? So over the years, people have been working in this area. I think the second speaker also gave a very nice talk in the developing different kind of CO2 capture technologies, right? So combined together, people call this CCS, right? Carbon capture and storage, right? I'm not going to talk this too much, but this is first. Post-combustion is related to the second talk. So people always use the amine to absorb the CO2, right? So then you get a relatively high concentration of the CO2 removed. And the other interesting approach is called fuel combustion. So this is the process. In this process, the fuel, all the fossil fuel is combusted in the pure CO2, not the air. Right? So in this case, theoretically, you could get the pure CO2 and steam. Steam will be condensed by water to water, and the pure CO2 will be stored. But this is ideal case. Most time, so you will need to deal with the impurity. Right? So for example, coal, low quality coal will produce a lot of, the impurity. You have to, deal with this. So that's why this technology also has some drawback, right? So after capture, the CO2 need to be stored somewhere, right? So most time will be stored underground in the sea. So this also raises another question. So is this safe, right? So people are working in this area, try to see if this long-term storage of the high pressure CO2 inside underground is safe or not. A lot of simulation studies are being working on this area, right? In addition to capture, people also want to see how we can use this, right? So I think this paper reviews 10 different pathways to see how we can use this, CO2 into different, scales. So the conclusion is optimistic, but still there's a lot of challenges, both technologically and economically. Okay, so this is a brief overview about the capture and utilization, but really I want to focus on the conversion part. So DOE classify this conversion into several different approaches. So what I want to highlight is the catalytic pathways. So this could be done by several different processes, the photocatalysis and also the electrocatalysis. Here I want to focus on the photocatalysis because inspired by nature. So people always want to develop a so-called artificial photocatalysis, right? So this slide, this is my dream, right? So it's my dream if we could develop or engineer the efficient photocatalyst that is analog to this ice cream cone, right? So to capture and convert CO2 into something useful. So in this way, we can cool our Earth, right? So using this engineering approach, but this obviously there's a long way to go, but we are working in this direction. Okay, so to understand this artificial photosynthesis, first let's just go over this so-called photocatalysis fundamentals a little bit so that you understand the topic better. So for the typical photocatalyst, so we usually will undergo several different processes. The first one is called photoexcitation, because the UR catalyst need to be activated by the light to generate the so-called electron and hole pairs for the redox reaction at the conduction band and the valence band. At the same time, you also have electron and hole trapping. But unfortunately, so you also have the competing process called recombination, because the generated electron and holes will recombine to generate heat. So this is a significant loss. And also, unfortunately, this process happens very fast, usually within several nanoseconds, right? So this is the major limiting factor in photocatalysis. So that's why a lot of work is trying to reduce the recombination or try to speed up the charge transfer in this process. So this is the other problem is the absorption capacity. Many catalysts also do not have a very high absorption rate. So this is related to the mass transfer. So that's why fundamentally in designing the efficient photocatalyst, we want to focus is charge transfer and mass transfer. Right? So that's why for CO2 photo reduction part, so we really want to look into several different materials, right? So this is not easy. So we look into different kinds of materials, look at their redox potential, try to see if we can select some kind of material, magic material, actually not. So usually single material is not able to do all the work. So usually we want to combine them together. And as I explained before, CO2 is very inert, right? So that's why reduce CO2 into different products is extremely difficult. Most time in the photocatalysis part, so we will just can get the CO2 to get a carbon monoxide, or sometimes get a formic acid, right? Because these two chemicals require very less electron and hole pairs, right? So electron and protons. But obviously, we also want to get something, with high value, right? So for example, the methanol or methane. But in this case, even thermodynamically favorable, but the reaction requires more electrons. So for example, for the methane case, you need 8 electrons, 8 protons. That means your catalyst, the charge separation process should be very, very efficient. Otherwise, you cannot achieve this. So that's why this is the challenging work. So keep all this in mind. So we started to develop several different kinds of photocatalysts, right? So I just give you some examples. The first example is the so-called 1D platinum TiO2 nanocolumns. So in this structure, we design this kind of the forest. We call this forest a nano forest, right? So we decorated this with the platinum nanoparticles, try to increase the conversion efficiency. And interestingly, so here at the result, we not only get a CO, but also we get a methane. So this is interesting because methane is hard to get. You need 8 electrons, right? So that's extremely difficult. We also see the trend, as a function of the platinum particles. So the second example is to develop the heterojunction, right? So we initially grow this copper oxide nanowires and decorated the nanowire with the zinc oxide, the islands by using the atomic layer deposition, right? So with this approach, we can get the relatively uniform decoration of this one to form the so-called junction, right? So this junction, the purpose of this junction is to improve the charge transfer, and with also the unique surface roughness and the structure. So this kind of combination can increase the overall efficiency to convert CO2 into carbon monoxide. And during the past several years, I have also been working on the so-called metal organic frameworks. I think Dr. Henny, so he is an expert in this area. So I learned a lot from him and try to use this material for the CO2 conversion. So metal organic frameworks has very high surface area and tunable pore structure and surface functionality. So the material itself is not easy to use directly for photocatalysis, but usually used as the support, right, to enhance the mass transfer. So we have been able to make different kinds of MOF-based photocatalysts during the past several years. I will pick maybe only 2 examples to explain. So firstly is the binary structure. So this one is try to enhance the mass transfer to increase the overall the efficiency. And the second example is the so-called ternary structure. In this case, we try to improve understand the charge transfer, not just the mass transfer. So these are 2 typical examples. Okay, so this first example is binary, composite. So we code this TiO2 with the so-called HKST1 matrix. So this is a MOF. A highly porous material can absorb more CO2 into the structure. And we put this material into a flow chamber and irradiated by the solar simulator, right? So and analyzed by different techniques. So then we found that we can get a CO in this case. Okay, so if you compare with the pure TiO2, so the composite obviously have a much higher performance, right? So this we attribute this to the increased amount of the surface area to increase the mass transfer. And then we verified by using the absorption measurements. If you see this figure, right? So the HKST1, the MOF, has a much faster and higher capacity, absorption capacity, and then the TiO2 case. Right? So we also check the surface, chemistry of this CO2 react with the catalyst. Right? So interestingly, we found that In the case of HPST1, so we found CO2 react with the interact with the copper more easily. So this is the more stronger binding, right? So we thought this stimulate our interest in this area further. We try to see if this kind of so-called open metal sites could contribute to the activation of CO2 or not. So, so for this purpose, we designed the so-called ternary structure. Here, we put a TiO2 and a Cu2O to form the heterojunction, and we grow the CuBTC from the Cu2O surface to form this kind of ternary structure. And we also kept the amount of the CuBTC is very low. Just try to minimize the absorption effect to only understand the unsaturated copper sites in the charge transfer. And we did a series of experiments, try to verify if we form this structure successfully. And then we put this material into a reactor and try to see. Interestingly, we also found that we can get a CO and a methane, right? So, and also for the ternary structure, we have a better performance and a higher methane formation ratio. That means, so this material also contributes this kind of charge transfer significantly. And we did a serious experiment to verify, to analyze the charge transfer density by using the chemical probe method. If you see this left slide, so they, as compared to the other two samples, this ternary structure has the highest the whole density. That means we have a better charge separation. We also use some other technique called in situ FTIR, or you can say this is drift system, to analyze the intermediates to understand the CO2 conversion pathways even further. So here for these ternary structures, we found this kind of format and CO2 radical in the process. That means we have more active intermediates. So these are can reduce the overall reaction pathways. So based on this result, we found that our process could be energetically favorable because we only need 6 electrons as compared to the 8 electron process in the previous direct CO2 to methane process. So this are the summary. So we think this engineering approach is possible to remove the CO2, and artificial photosynthesis is obviously a promising way, but still has a long way to go. The efficiency and the selectivity, all these kind of things we need to think about, and design the efficient catalyst is obviously a key, right, to cool the earth. So with this, I would like to finish my presentation. Thank you.
Excellent. Any question for Winnie? Okay.
Yeah, just to tell you that artificial photosynthesis has been there since 1975. Okay.
Yeah.
In 70s, Melvin Kelvin did a lot of CO2 reduction.
Yeah.
Check the Jack's papers and all this paper.
Yeah, I checked your paper.
No, I'm saying it is people have been doing.
Yeah.
Photocatalysis, the problem is a lot of papers people have published because of carbon impurities. People have been retracted the paper, so one has to be very careful doing photocatalytic reduction. Making micromolar concentration will not lead us anywhere. Just my thought, okay?
Sure, sure.
The second one is the proton coupled electron transfer is a very difficult process. Read some fundamental papers. You can get only one electron at a time. You will never get multiple electron transfer. You can show me one spectroscopic evidence for multiple electron transfer on a semiconductor surface. There is none.
Okay, okay, thank you. Yeah.
It has to go, if you do electrochemistry, it always you see the one electron reduction first. You will never see multiple.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very nice talk, a lot of information. Thanks for the My name is Chandan Samantray from Virginia State University.
Okay.
So your nanocomposite is a HK-UST is a core cell approach
Yes.
or is a core cell approach?
Yes.
Okay. And yeah, that's what I'm asking. Like ALD is your nanotech, VCU nanotech center? ALD,
ALD.
atomic layer deposition.
Yes.
Where? Here? VCU?
No, that work is not that done at the VCU. That's at the Washington University in St. Louis. Yeah.
Okay, you're aware, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, so Dr. Kamath, like, cited like the multi-electron transport kind of thing. So people believe that photosynthesis is a kind of quantum phenomenon. Yeah, there is a 4 or 5 PRL papers, and that is all uncertainty of carbon capture.
Yeah.
So they relate like that.
Yeah,
Very complex structures, complex process.
Yeah.
So do you believe that is a quantum phenomenon? Photosynthesis is a quantum phenomenon.
Yeah. So because I would say the photosynthesis, artificial photosynthesis is extremely challenging. Yeah, extremely challenging because the efficiency so far, I think from our research, we never reach 1% quantum efficiency. So that's the challenging part. Yeah.
Okay. Any more questions for Winnie or any of the speakers? I'll just ask. So you listed the carbon capture efficiency of plants being overall 1%, which is right. And the C4 crops like grasses or sugarcane, they are like 4%, right?
Yeah.
And so, and 4% is pretty good actually for free. Actually, they can capture carbon for free. And maybe we should be designing just use that and then build from there.
Yeah. So we'll think about that.
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's a nature's chemical factory. It doesn't require no catalyst preparation. No, it's the spring is a beautiful thing because in just 8 days, it gets all the chemicals needed to make leaves, stems, everything. It is just mind-boggling. How does the nature does all these chemicals, and then they have to organize in a way, in the same fashion. Every leaf has the same structure. It's really mind-boggling.
Excellent. Well, with that, we have a break for coffee, and I'm not sure if we have ice cream or not today, but I will look for ice cream today. So we will gather again at 11 o'clock for next session. Thank you. Okay. Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much. Talk to you with the photocatalysis. So you, yes, okay if I cut you off at 25?
Yeah.
You don't okay, a couple of minutes extra.
And in fact, if
it will be late for rice.
if you want to like
Okay.
wave at me at 20 minutes, then I can make sure.
Sounds good.
And
Yeah. How are you doing?
I'm all happy. I try to. For how one at a time, but
I just wanted you to know. I'm going to be thinking early, but I'm on vacation. Okay. Workshop today, but I didn't want you to think. No worries. Oh, please.
Okay, I think we're ready to start this next session. So thanks everybody for being here. We've got 3 great speakers lined up. I'm going to do a brief introduction and then get us going. So our first talk is Brian Hubble. He's the director of the National Research Program on Air, Climate, and Energy in the EPA's Office of Research and Development. Following Brian, we have Andrea Simonelli, Associate Professor of Political Science here at VCU. And then Ivy Main, who is with the Sierra Club and is a activist and advocate in the climate and energy space. So thanks everybody for being here. And Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you. Oh, there you are.
I'm gonna come right across.
There you go. Do you want this?
No, I don't need that. I actually just need the pointer.
Oh,
There we
good.
go.
You're
Excellent.
good.
All right.
All right, enjoy.
So good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to be here and talk to you about the work that EPA does to address the causes and consequences of climate change. And I'm going to keep this at a very high level as opposed to the previous speakers who got right into the engineering. That's going to be much more of an overview of the work we do. A lot of you probably aren't familiar with the work that EPA's research program does on climate change. We're in the process now still of ramping that up after a few years where it was ramped down. So looking forward to sharing with you what we are doing. I want to start though by setting the stage for what EPA is thinking about in terms of the ways that we are addressing climate change. And it's important to understand the ways that climate change itself affects environment and affects environmental protection. So I'm going to focus on a couple of indicators of climate change that are really relevant for environmental protection. And these are taken from EPA's Climate Indicators Report. And I'll just note throughout my presentation, there's a lot of links, and I encourage you to explore some of those links to get some great information about different reports and different websites that EPA has that addresses a number of these issues. So I'm going to talk about temperature change, both for ambient temperatures and also water temperatures as drivers for some of the environmental concerns that we have. So looking at the figure on the left, this is showing the rate of temperature change in the United States from 1900 to 2020. And you can see that across the vast majority of the United States, we're seeing pretty significant increases in temperatures. So why is this a concern for environmental protection? Well, I'm going to go into this a little more in a couple of slides, but basically what we're concerned about is the impacts that temperatures have on air quality. And it can be both direct impacts and indirect impacts. And I'm going to talk about those in a little bit. And then on the right, this is showing the increase in water temperatures in streams in the Virginia and Maryland area. And you can see again that for a lot of Virginia, you're seeing pretty significant increases in stream temperatures. So why do we care about this? Well, this impacts water quality in a number of different ways, for example, by reducing dissolved oxygen levels. And this has important implications for significant species like brown trout and river trout. And so this is something we're very concerned about in terms of trying to address the impacts on water quality. So coming back to the impacts on air quality. So one of the big things we've established over a number of years, and in fact, this was one of the driving factors that led to the endangerment finding that enabled EPA to move forward with regulations of greenhouse gases, is that higher temperatures are going to lead to higher ozone formation in a good part of the United States. And so what we're seeing based on looking at the projections of climate change into the future, we've now coupled that with air quality models. And what we're seeing is that you have a substantial increase in ozone formation as we move towards future scenarios. Now, this isn't the case across the entire US. You can see in this picture that as you get to the southeast, in fact, we're going to see some potential decreases in ozone concentrations due to climate change. But in a substantial part of the Midwest and Northeast, we see pretty big increases in ozone. And this has implications for health. And I'll talk about this a little bit later in the talk, but what we're seeing is that this can increase the burden associated with things like premature death, hospitalizations for respiratory causes, asthma, et cetera. So it's a concern for us in terms of thinking about how we're going to protect public health against the impacts of air quality and how we're going to be able to attain our national ambient air quality standards in the future. One thing I will note, though, in this picture is that this is holding emissions constant when you're looking at these different scenarios. And we do expect that regulations that are on the book and regulations that are being planned are going to reduce emissions, and so that will reduce the impact of that climate change can have in the future. Climate change can also impact air quality in indirect ways. Climate change is expected to increase the severity and extent of wildfires. And what we've seen is that this is increasing the amount of emissions from smoke that are contributing to poor PM air quality, it's particulate matter air quality. And particulate matter has been associated with a wide range of health effects, including premature death, cardiovascular hospitalizations, and other types of impacts. And so when we look at what kind of impacts climate is having on wildfires, we're seeing that already to date, we're seeing an increase in wildfire emissions. This is information taken from the National Emissions Inventory that EPA puts out. This is from the 2017 inventory. It shows that wildfires account for wildland fires, which includes prescribed fires and wildfires, accounts for about 44% of direct PM 2.5 emissions. And then of this, about 67% of that is due to wildfires. Prescribed fires accounts for about 32%. And both of these are important because as we're seeing an increase in wildfires and wildfire risk, we're seeing that our land management agencies like the U.S. Forest Service and Department of Interior as part of their national strategy, are planning to increase the amount of prescribed fires by an enormous amount, which means that we're going to be seeing additional emissions occurring from prescribed fires as a tool to manage the impacts of climate change. So both ozone and PM are expected to be impacted, and these are both critical aspects of EPA's work to try to protect populations from exposures to those pollutants. I also want to talk about things related to precipitation and sea level rise. So sea level rise, again, this is actually, these two figures are from our most recent National Climate Assessment, as well as the third National Climate Assessment. And if you haven't had a chance to look at those reports, they are really impressive reports that document the impacts that climate change is having in the United States. And what we're seeing is that vulnerability to sea level rise is very high in the Southeast. You can see that, as you would expect, on the Gulf, you see New Orleans and parts of Mississippi and Alabama are at high risk. But you also see that in Virginia Beach, for example, is at very high vulnerability to the effects of sea level rise. And what does that mean? Well, sea level rise has a number of impacts. It affects sensitive ecosystems. It affects infrastructure. It affects chances of flooding due to storm surge. And all these things can impact things like water quality and stormwater management systems. And these are especially felt in communities that have low investments in infrastructure. So these include communities with environmental justice concerns, low-income communities. So it's something we're very concerned about. And likewise, with heavy precipitation, we're seeing increases in heavy precipitation. I experienced some of that this morning on my drive up from Durham. There was a lot of heavy precipitation. In addition to the direct effects it has, like car accidents, which I also dealt with a lot. I was planning to be here about 8:30 and got here about 9:30. So, but what we're seeing is that there's a lot of locations in the Southeast where you see increasing precipitation, and this can have impacts in terms of flood risk. And flood risk can lead to environmental problems because it can affect water quality, it can reflect increases in contaminant releases, and it can affect air quality indoors because of increases in mold. Again, very much felt by low-income communities who don't have the ability to address their housing stock. So you can see that climate change has the potential to impact environmental protection on a number of different fronts. And these are just a few of those. There's many others as well that we're concerned about. I also want to mention the other part of what EPA does, in addition to thinking about the impacts on air quality, water quality, et cetera, is we think about the causes of climate change. EPA is a regulatory agency, and we put out regulations now that are addressing climate forcing pollutants. And so one of the things we're looking at is how do we best support that work in terms of the regulatory approaches to addressing climate pollutants. And you can see from this graphic that while we've had some progress over the last several decades in reducing carbon emissions, we still have a long way to go. And while we've made some progress in this is the power sector, we've made progress in the power sector, we've made some progress in the industrial sector. We haven't made very much progress on transportation, and we haven't made as much progress on things like residential emissions associated with residential use. And we still have a long way to go with industrial use. So these are sectors we're looking at, and I'm going to talk about some of those and some of the work we're doing on some of those later on. I will note that EPA is putting out regulations on this. We just put out heavy duty and light duty vehicle standard proposals, which should help us move towards vehicle electrification and reduction in emissions of greenhouse gases. And we're expecting to put out a replacement for the Clean Power Plan, which was EPA's proposed regulation over the last decade to address energy emissions. And by the way, I expect that some of those regulatory approaches will include carbon capture in different ways. And so that's going to be something that will build off the previous presentations. So EPA's mission is to protect human health and the environment. A lot of people don't think about us as a public health agency, but we very much are. Part of our job is to protect public health. And we also work to protect ecosystems and the ecosystem services provided. So one of the things that we're doing is we are improving our ability to track greenhouse gas emissions. We're responsible for producing the nation's greenhouse gas inventory. And so we support that. We use sound science to support a number of different activities related to reducing emissions and addressing the needs of communities and states in terms of adaptation and resilience measures. And what I'm going to talk about today is the way we're advancing the science on a number of these different issues. For those of you who aren't aware of the way EPA does research, we have a research office that I'm part of. We have about 1,200 scientists who work within our research office, as well as the number of support staff. We are organized in 6 research programs. I am the National Program Director for the Air, Climate, Energy Research Program. However, all of our programs are touched by climate change in one way or another. And so we all work together to try to address climate change as a cross-cutting issue. And we're supported in our programs by our scientists who are located in 4 different centers. And we're located around the country. So we have our main offices in Cincinnati, Ohio, Washington, D.C., and down in RTP, North Carolina, where I am. But we have locations of our laboratories all throughout the country. And this uniquely positions us to address climate change in terms of its impacts in different parts of the country. And this is very important because places like out in the West are dealing with things like wildfire increases, while places in the East are dealing with more like flood situations, likewise down in Gulf Breeze, Florida. The way that we take our approach to climate change is to understand that, unlike some of our other challenges, which follow a more traditional environmental management paradigm, looking, for example, at sources and then concentrations and then exposures and then impacts, we recognize that climate change, together with addressing the challenges of environmental injustices, that this requires us to take a systems approach that really understands that climate change affects all of these different elements of the source to impacts continuum. So we're working to address environmental inequities. We're working to address climate change in a holistic fashion by linking together all the different elements of our work, including bringing social sciences together with natural sciences. And I'll talk about that a little bit in the future as well. So after a lot of conversations with our stakeholders, which includes our program offices within EPA, the air, the water office within EPA, we also reached out to states and tribes and local organizations to understand the needs that they have for protecting the environment and the changing climate. And we focused in 3 different areas for our research. That includes interventions, which are intended to protect public health in the face of immediate threats from extreme events like extreme precipitation events, by fires, by droughts. And we're focusing on our most vulnerable and impacted populations. Unfortunately, many of the same populations that face or are overburdened with traditional environmental threats like chemical contamination are also now at the front lines of addressing climate impacts. So we're working with them. We're also working on our prevention focus area to inform preparedness, adaptation, and resilience measures. This is looking at longer-term public health and well-being. And again, we are focused on involving urban, rural, and tribal communities in our approaches to addressing these issues. And then lastly, we're working on transformation of the energy and transportation and housing sectors and working to identify and quantify the public health and environmental benefits of reducing greenhouse gases in an equitable way that benefits all Americans. So over the next few slides, I'm going to take you kind of on a whirlwind tour of the work that we're doing at the Office of Research and Development. Again, there's links to a number of the different research activities, and I'm happy to answer questions later about specific projects or direct you to our investigators who are working on these areas. So this first area I want to talk about is on climate equity and building community capacity. And here we're working on developing the tools that are needed to be able to address climate impacts and build equitable futures for these communities that are heavily impacted. One of our areas is focused on health outcomes. And so we're doing the primary research to understand how climate impacts health, both individually, but also in conjunction with other stressors. And this is kind of a cumulative impacts approach. And one of the things we're doing here is trying to understand better the burden that's faced by different communities in terms of the types of health impacts, like due to extreme heat events, urban heat islands. And we're going to be working to then provide that information and translate that information into forms that can be used by public health agencies and by environmental agencies to plan for and respond to these types of events. We're also looking at the impacts of historical racist practices like redlining on climate and health, both looking at how it has affected exposures to climate stressors, but also how it might affect the ability of communities to respond to climate stressors, for example, due to lower access to healthcare. We're also through a partnership with our Region 5 office in EPA. EPA has 10 regional offices around the country. We're working to strengthen capacity for environmental justice communities to address climate change impacts by helping them to understand how they can better interact through collaborative governance processes with local, state, regional and national organizations. And this is something that we have our social science scientists who are working together with the communities. And then last, we're also developing online tools to help assist with adaptation planning. And these are intended to help, again, communities as well as regional organizations plan to protect their natural resources in the face of a changing climate. As I mentioned earlier, air quality is a big issue for EPA. And so we're looking at a couple different ways of understanding the impacts of climate on air quality and health. As I mentioned, we're modeling the impacts of climate on air quality in the future. And we're also now translating those impacts into human health outcomes. And so we're looking at what is the likely burden of, for example, exposures to ozone and particulate matter in the future when we have greater wildfire prevalence, and also when we have higher ozone levels. And then we're also looking at the ways that climate change interacts with air pollution to cause health effects, recognizing there may be synergistic effects, for example, between high heat days and high ozone and PM days, and that may be more than additive in its effect on human health. We're also concerned about ecosystem impacts and the ability of ecosystems to continue to sequester carbon, for example. We have a study going on in the Chesapeake Bay area that's a partnership with Crisville, Maryland, which is a lower income community that's dealing with flood risks. And we're working with them to try to understand how things like increases in seagrass can help both address their flood risk, but also can sequester carbon. And we're looking also at how climate change may change the ability of those types of nature-based solutions to actually continue to store carbon in the future under a changed climate. We're also working with NOAA, the National Oceanographic Organization, to use their climate projection scenarios together with our models to downscale to a finer grain spatial scale climate data so that we can provide, for example, precipitation projections and flooding projections at a very local scale to help inform adaptation actions at the local scale. And then we also have a number of tools that are available on our Global Change Explorer website. And I encourage you to take a look at this. This site contains a number of tools that can help with adaptation planning. For example, we have our ICLUS model, which provides projections of land use and population. And we have our LASSO tool, which allows you to interact with a number of climate change scenarios based from other organizations, explore those scenarios, and then download the data for your use. As I mentioned, wildfires is a concern. There's going to be increasing extent and severity of wildfires. So we're trying to understand the impact of those climate-induced wildfire changes on things like critical habitat for salmon in the Western United States. We're also looking at water quality. Water quality is directly impacted by wildfires. When it crosses into the wildland-urban interface where cities are, it can result in release of VOCs in water systems due to melting of pipes. It can also result in runoff and release of contaminants that can affect drinking water. We also have a long-standing study that's been going on for about 5 years called our Wildfire Aspire study. That's what Aspire stands for down there. And that study is looking at indoor and outdoor air quality during wildfire smoke events. And what we've been finding are ways to improve building resilience to smoke events by improving HVAC systems and also looking at the effectiveness of different portable air cleaners in terms of reducing smoke exposures and improving the health of populations. And one of the things we've just recently published is a study that looked at do-it-yourself air cleaners and how to construct an effective system for reducing smoke exposures. And then we have a loan program that we've developed where we're providing advanced technologies to states and tribes and local organizations so that they can better measure air quality during smoke events, including we have a part of that system is called our vehicle add-on mobile monitoring system, which is a monitoring system that can be attached to any vehicle that can be used during fire events so that personnel on the ground can drive into, for example, valleys that are hard to reach otherwise, and they can get direct on-the-ground observations of air quality that can help improve fire personnel health, but also help downwind communities. We're also looking at a number of interventions to try to reduce impacts of climate change. This includes behavioral interventions that can help to improve choices that people make around energy, both household energy and transportation. We're also looking at serious games as a tool for educating communities and also educating decision makers on the impacts of different choices they make. We have actually a game already called Generate, which allows us to look at energy choices. Again, I encourage you to look at that on the web because it's a really interesting STEM tool as well as something that can be used with community organizations. And we have a new one that's being developed called the Mobility Game, which allows you to look at choices for transportation. We're also providing guidance to communities on how to select effective green infrastructure designs. And we're also looking at how you can measure the multiple benefits of green infrastructure. For example, roadway barriers, which can achieve benefits both for reducing heat effects, it can reduce air pollution, and it can be a form of carbon sequestration. And then the last part is the work that we're doing on nature-based solutions. And I mentioned one of those occurring in Maryland, but this is a broader look at these nature-based solutions, including looking at how wetlands can be enhanced in terms of their ability to store carbon. We also are doing work on energy systems and how to look at decarbonization pathways. We have a relatively sophisticated set of energy system models that allow us to look at the emissions and the air quality and the energy electricity price effects of different decarbonization routes. And we have a tool called Glimpse, which is an interface with these energy models that allows planners to create scenarios and map those scenarios out in terms of their impacts on emissions and electricity. And then we have a very localized model that's called Comet, which does the same type of optimization of energy pathways, but does it for the urban scale. And then the last thing I want to mention is our work on methane, which is an important greenhouse gas. It's much more potent than CO2 in the shorter and medium term. And we also have less understanding of how well we can measure methane from important sources like oil and gas operations and landfills. And so we're doing a lot of work right now on how do we bring together all the data we can capture, both from ground-based observations, from aerial flyovers, as well as from remote sensing from satellites. And we're working with our partners in NOAA and NASA to be able to bring all that data together. We've also done a lot of work recently on methane emissions from reservoirs. This again has been a not well understood source of methane, but yet potentially significant. And we've really improved our ability to understand methane from reservoirs. And right now we have a partnership with USGS to take methane measurements around the country to help us understand how environmental variability can affect methane emissions. And then finally, I'll end by talking about some organizational changes that we've been making to try to address this really complex challenge of climate change. And one of the things that we recognize is that integrating social sciences is a key to this, because on all dimensions, both in terms of the causes of climate change, in terms of the solutions, and in terms of the behavioral limitations associated with getting people to reduce their emissions, they all require an understanding of human behavior. And so we're bringing social sciences in. In addition, social sciences are really critical when you're going to try to do work with communities. And so we're recognizing that to do community engaged research, we really need to bring the social sciences in. And we've created a new division called our Integrated Climate Sciences Division that is really focused on this kind of integration and on working with frontline communities to do co-produced research that really addresses their problems at a local scale. So this is an exciting development for us. The Inflation Reduction Act, which Congress passed last year, has a very large appropriation of funds that is helping us work with communities through direct block grants and also through partnerships. So if you all have communities in your area that have these kind of concerns and challenges, there's opportunities there to partner with those communities, because you can't apply for those grants yourself. They have to be a partnership with a community organization. I encourage you to keep track of the grant process as it's being carried out over the next year, because there are opportunities there. And that's it. If you have questions, again, I'm happy to answer some now, but also feel free to reach out to me through email, and I'm happy to connect you with our scientists. Yeah, thank you. Okay.
I was wondering if we collaborate as a nation with other countries on our approaches, because these issues are global issues. And we look at the Sustainable Development Goals, we're trying to do it together. I was wondering how that works, and could you tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, so we do collaborate both with other governments, and we collaborate with other non-governmental organizations internationally. Especially around issues like wildfires. That's an area we've been working internationally, partnering with folks like Australia and other locations. We work on methane, global methane inventories. We work on different measurement methods in a partnership with a number of different countries. We also are working on a lot of air quality issues and looking at sort of long-range transport of ozone in particular matter and how that's impacted by climate change. Again, with intergovernment organizations and partnerships, these are well established. There's a UN program on hemispheric transport of air pollution that we've been involved with for a number of years. So yes, we do partner internationally, both in terms of these partnerships that occur at the higher levels, but we also try to find collaborative opportunities to go work on. One example is cook stoves. This is a source both of particulate matter, but also there are opportunities to reduce climate emissions from international use of cook stoves. And for example, we are planning to go to Ghana and work with the Ghana organization that works on cook stoves to share our technology and our methods and help them build capacity.
Do you have any examples of countries that perhaps do not speak English? When I think about Africa, you just mentioned Ghana. 40% of Africa, the universities operate in French, and they work primarily with the EU, but sometimes we would like them to come across the Atlantic and work with us. Do we occasionally work with countries whose prime language of doing business is not?
We do, and it is a challenge. We've been fairly successful in working with folks who are Spanish speaking. We have a lot of Spanish speaking scientists who are able to make that translation. We also have a number of, we have a fairly strong international background of scientists within the Office of Research and Development. We've had some good relationships with some Asian countries, including China in the past. We've also had good working relationships with countries in, for example, Eastern Europe. We've had some good interactions there, but it is a challenge. It is a challenge to work with other languages and make sure that everybody's sharing information. And one of the challenges, of course, is being able to translate not just the language, but also translate data systems and other things that maybe have different kind of. Yeah, that's right.
Any other questions or people want to jump into thought?
How effective are your educational programs?
Broadly speaking, well, so it's interesting you asked that question, because one of the things we're trying to do, in addition to just measuring the number of people that we reach, which is a fairly large number of people through our educational programs, we're also starting to include formal evaluation, which is when we bring our social scientists in, they can be very effective at developing these evaluation metrics, where we're looking at more quantitative measures of changes, for example, in perceptions of people who have taken the course, changes in their understanding of different decision pathways, especially as we move forward with things like serious games and other engagement activities. We are working to be able to establish appropriate baselines and then look at the change in different metrics.
Well, I'll jump in with one question, Brian. I'm curious if the EPA is thinking about retreat at all, whether it's coastal or forest fire related, and whether that's on the radar for y'all.
It is. In fact, I just had a conversation yesterday with one of my scientists about managed retreat and how we address those issues. And one of the interesting things with managed retreat, in addition to the environmental justice issues that arise with that, is that it actually can create new problems. One of the things we're concerned about is increases in population density in places that don't currently have air quality problems. It may generate air quality problems because now you have more emissions occurring in those areas, as well as a number of other issues. But yeah, managed retreat is a concern, especially again, the environmental justice implications of that.
I think we're going to probably move on to Andrea, but thank you, Brian.
All right. Thank you.
Hey, Andrea, you're up.
Thank you.
You want to walk around?
Yeah, probably. I have a pacer.
We'll just click that on your lanyard.
Okay, whatever works. Hold it or.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got a pocket. That'll do. And front and back. All right, cool. Good morning. What a great segue, I suppose. Managed retreat being one of the major issues for climate impacts of the whole. So for me, my work is migration, displacement, tribe communities in a little bit of the US, but mostly globally has been my work. So this has been a nice sort of awkward segue because this is where, the social sciences take over and get a little tricky. I am an associate professor in the political science department, and I've been working on these issues for, unfortunately, because we don't have a solution yet, clearly, since 2009. So it seems like it's been growing quite a bit. This photo was taken on one of my trips when I was out in the Pacific from Tuvalu. And so a lot of the places we're looking at and trying to understand what migration displacement options and how do we deal with this as a society level, often look at communities who are in positions of not having a lot of space to begin with and how we deal with them. So a little bit about me. One, I get to work on islands around the world. How terrible. I know some people pick life paths where they're like, sitting in a lab all day. I get to work in the sunshine. It's fantastic. But on the negative side, it's also in some of the most beautiful places with some of the most rich cultures that I've ever met that unfortunately we're looking at not knowing what their futures look like. And the other side of that is incredibly depressing. But I've been working on the idea of migration displacement and essentially the global governance of this for as long as I've been working on this topic. And the bigger picture has been that global governance or even regional governance or even national governance, unfortunately, has been really a stalling kind of scenario because we're not really sure, as we're getting more data over the years of what is happening in terms of the impacts, right, of all the science we've been looking at the last couple of days ourselves, that we see a slow erosion of a lot of communities. But in terms of answers, geopolitically, we still don't have amazing outcomes to look to. There's been very few projects globally where people have actually made a planned retreat of any sort or planned migration to move, to relocate, and what we do with that. And even the few options that have occurred in terms of case studies in the globe have been, have unfurled in ways that we didn't anticipate. So we still have not had a managed reorganization of people that has worked very well in a lot of ways. So unfortunately, in terms of standards of what we can repeat and look to, there just hasn't been much. So in trying to understand what communities need, and especially the way I've been working on the ground, it's that every case, unfortunately, is its own. So that makes the complication of how to create a system or a standard much more difficult. So we've all been doing impacts for days. I'll probably just rush through this. The idea of the way that social science tends to view it is sort of an interconnection, that the impacts that we look at are interrelated. So just as the previous speaker got to talk about, we've got the fires and all the different ways that EPA is doing this, trying to take that into moving forward it's what does all this do for individuals, not just on their health and livelihoods and well-being, but what does this look for our civilizations or, communities? So between fires and risk and malnourishment, the problem, of course, with interrelation is we have system disruption. So normal doesn't really exist anymore. So what we get to expect and what we know to expect continues to change. And so because we know that climate change is an impact, or it's like a multiplier on threat, we can't really look at a linear movement forward. That normal will keep adjusting, and that's what really makes it difficult to know what we're doing. But we also have limits to adaptation. So these, fortunately, depend on individual tolerances. So we have to accept that not everyone is going to have impacts to their community and their own homes and livelihoods and take them in the same manner. So what impacts me and what I might have the resilience to overcome, my neighbor may not, and make the decision that they can't stay or it is just too much for them to bear. So we've got the individual tolerances of physical and emotional to deal with in these. And assets and opportunities can tend to be limited depending on what is actually in front of you. And that's what I'm going to walk through in a little bit, sort of thinking through those things. But we know that services tend to be undependable when we have major impacts. So just as Brian was talking about with the major fire, all of a sudden your normal social services in one area are now completely shut down, because even if it's only a temporary migration or dislocation, our communities start to unravel very quickly. And these all give us new governance challenges. So it tends to look a bit like this. This is what my brain does all the time. So that gives you any indication of how to manage the governance challenges to how to integrate all of these different things. can feel often very overwhelming. And so the work of this and trying to figure out how we unfurl basically the puzzle that is in our brains all the time, it can be challenging. But we know that impacts are huge, and especially even here. So I think one thing, at least I try to emphasize with my students is even though my work is international, that I don't want them to forget how much of this impact is actually right here at home, and for them to not think of all of these impacts as a far away item, but very much here. And especially if we just looked at 2022, where, I mean, we're talking 18 separate $1 billion weather and climate impact disasters. And that's just last year. We don't expect this to get better. So yay, right? Sorry, I'm always the bearer of really unfortunate news. So if I don't come up with a dark humor about it, I'm basically just going to cry to sleep every night. But we do know that because of these impacts, every time we have to either temporarily dislocate ourselves or come back or try to figure out where do we rebuild, we know that these things keep moving and changing based on the new patterns we're seeing. So it's like this constant evolving nightmare. So when we think about what this does for the overall looking at migration, disaster, and displacement, there are some fallacies to consider, and I just like to put them out there so we can sort of be done with it in this discussion. There is a migration versus displacement concern, in that migration and the language of migration is often proactive, as if I've made this choice because I'm excited about it, or at least because it's an option. And so it tends to be a decision to leave. There are no governance regimes that really manage this. They're all very individual. So if I wanted to move anywhere, I'm bound by the laws and policies of the migration regime, which is very minimal. So I have to get a visa, I have to go somewhere, I have to make these choices, I have to know that I have a place to buy. So we think of migration as sort of this like active pursuit of something, whereas displacement tends to be a more reactive, which would be maybe towards a disaster or something it's you weren't aware of. Aid agency can help. We have plenty of them, obviously, for at least quick disaster, but they're often temporary solutions. So if I have to leave for a wildfire or a flood, we're not talking long term. We're talking, like Red Cross help. And then the real rebuilding of that is kind of up to you. And most of these are usually internal, not so much external to country boundaries. And so you're kind of bound by what your country can do. And so obviously that varies widely based on what those apparatus look like. And then the refugee regime, which gets brought up all the time, which I have to deal with whether I like it or not, deals with persecution. So when people say things like climate refugee, the climate cannot persecute you. It is impersonal. This is a no. It is usually a last resort, but it has the most robust protections. And I think that is why it continues to be implicated over and over in these discussions, because of the fact that it is, of all the regimes to manage these types of issues, the most robust, the most developed, the most money of any agency. But the reality is a lot of people who will maybe proactively make the decision, I can't tolerate what's happening in my home anymore, will unfortunately still be displaced, because you're not really moving because you're excited about it or it's a choice you made because you were thrilled. It's that I am moving now while I still have assets potentially before things get too bad. So most migration will technically be a displacement. And so we deal, I think, in this field with all of the ideas of billions, bazillions of refugees in terms of how these things get discussed in the press, especially. And God love the media. The sensationalism of this, I think, sometimes disrupts us from the real difficult questions and problems to handle. So just as a quick overview, refugees have originated in ancient times. It was the most original form of hospitality through the Middle East. And what this gave us was a minimum standard. So the idea of you treated foreigners as your own people during times of conflict. And so this is a very ancient standard. And I think, again, because it goes back so far, we tend to always make these associations. But technically, it is a legal status. It's like calling someone a plaintiff. So you are not a refugee because someone categorically says that or is using it as a descriptor. You are a refugee because you have gone through a legal process and have given this as a status. Otherwise, you're an asylum seeker. So to be clear, the language of this often gets sort of muddled because, again, you're not just a plaintiff unless you're in a case. So it's a very legal term. And so the way that this breaks down for people who are less familiar with it, especially, I think the sciences too, this probably is something you run into too often, is the refugee regime is built around and very specifically tailored to the events and outcomes of World War II. So you're looking at being persecuted for being a member of a particular group and also being outside your country of nationality. So what that means is it's twofold, that again, we can't just use this as a descriptor. So the only way to be a refugee is to be persecuted and to have crossed a border. And we know that this has been litigated too. So even the idea of taking climate refugee and saying, well, we're going to use it and haven't we seen this challenged? Well, yes, and it has not worked. So this is Ion Tessiota and his case coming from Kiribati, and I've spent most of my time the last couple of years in this box. Was one of the more popularized cases that we do know about. And so Kiribati faces, these tidal issues, king tides, erosion, many of the other like long-term issues, salinization of their water. But Mr. Tessiota came to New Zealand, like a lot of people do, on a work visa and overstayed because he'd heard about what's going on and had a couple of kids now and didn't really want to take his family back to New Zealand, which you can kind of understand because the impacts there are pretty intense. But the High Court and Court of Appeals in New Zealand have knocked this down a few times, even though it was litigated over a course of 5 or 6 years. And despite the sympathy for the people of Kiribati, the problem is that, again, he doesn't meet the criteria because the environment didn't persecute him as such. And really, even though people feel bad about the idea that things are going to continue to go poorly, that the criteria for the convention itself to be a refugee, again, is very, very narrow. So we know that this is just something that kind of needs to be off the table, but it tends to come up all the time. So the idea of numbers, especially in this realm, we get pushed, oh, how many people are going to move? Well, a lot. But the reality of that is a lot of it's internal. Because internal to countries, that's where you go if you've got an issue. When we have wildfires in California, people don't go rushing over the Canadian border. Okay, so we need to think about it in that. When we have movement, when we have impact disasters, that's all happening internal to countries. And people tend to go where they have community connection, where they have family, where they speak the language, where there are cultural ties. And we already know that even for most international migration. You see most often connections between countries of either historical origin, of colonial legacy, or things of that manner. So you don't sort of have the fear factor of everyone's coming somewhere. It's not that easy to just pick up and move in the first place, let alone needing the visa systems and everything we need. That's why you tend to see these. And so these are internal over external. And hyperbole tends to be very, very common. The idea of, well, how many billion? Well, the numbers don't matter. Essentially, if people are slowly doing this and we're not recognizing it as we see it day to day anyway, we're not even sure where we're going to catch these numbers. So I shouldn't say that it's unnecessary because obviously planning for these things are, but it's much more localized. It's not, we can't just say, okay, we're going to move all these people somewhere because it detaches them from justice, communities, their families, things of this sort. And so we do know that a lot of the displacement statistics look at the idea of, this is just one of many infographics on, climate migrants, and we look at, per million in regions, we see all these numbers. But you notice what's sort of left out of this. Where's the developed world? Right? So often these discussions tend to get sort of hyperbolic and xenophobic real quick because so many things model migration, but never where we are, as if it's not happening here, or that people are coming here, or that what will happen. So the difficulty in having these discussions is often just really integrating that this is a global problem of all of us, of all of the impacts that we're seeing constantly, and not just something that's happening somewhere else. And that tends to be the focus too much, is it's always somewhere else versus realizing that most of this will be internal to our own nation as well. So we do have some international policy instruments. They're not legally binding, so that is unhelpful. But the Agenda for Protection of Cross-Border Displacement, International Organization for Migration, and the UN Refugee Office offer advice, but again, nothing binding. And so the only place we've really seen movement on this as a global function has been through the Warsaw Mechanism for Loss and Damage developed out of the UNFCCC, which came out of the 2012 and then the 2013 talks. And I had been there doing some negotiating on this and advocating for it. 10 years on, where are we? Well, unfortunately, migration has now fallen off. They're looking at finally setting up a fund for long-term loss and damage impacts. So damage above and beyond what adaptation and mitigation will manage. But the word migration is now back off of the negotiating table. So it has been very thinly added and taken off over the years. And we still don't really have a way to manage this, which is why this ends up being a more localized thing, because we still haven't had consensus, mostly from the larger nations who are concerned that they'll be liable for all of it. So it's often in the legalities where we all get stuck. So who can migrate? This often looks like an individual choice, but essentially it comes down to a lot of class divisions, which makes the justice element that really jump out at this. Because when we think about, do we have insurance? Like, what are the basics, right? If you were to be hit by an impact event, do you have assets? What kind of capital are you sitting on? What kind of personal transport do you have? That essentially, if you kind of think through where we are in terms of economic class, that if you have assets, if you've got capital investments, we start to have things that maybe work. Now, insurance is one of the bigger pieces that fall into this, but it can always be very sketchy because insurance companies have a lovely way, right, of saying, well, we'll take care of the wind damage, but maybe not the flood damage. So insurance doesn't always equate being able to actually function very well. And so in putting this together, I did look up that basically even your middle class has less than $6.5 thousand in just usable savings. So if you think about what you need as a last minute resort to go have to run away or do something, that can whittle yourself down real quickly to not having extra money, which is one of the biggest issues for displacement in the first place, or even especially moving into trapped communities, is if you don't have it, you don't have it. So essentially you're rich, you're middle class, gonna have some options, but everyone else starts to really look at not having the ability to actively move very well. Because if you don't have a new job, if you don't have items of value to sell, if you don't have personal transport, people in cities don't use cars. I don't have a car here anymore. So in any large city, where do you go if there's a big looming problem, if the government doesn't step in and we have to look at these as larger impact events, right? Because if you live in New York City and we're looking at another very big superstorm, you're not walking to New Jersey, right? And that leads us to think about what are trapped communities in this. And in so many ways, the question of who is trapped gets a little more complicated when we want to think about what are those asset bases and what does it really mean to be trapped. So sometimes communities are geographically isolated or physically vulnerable. And that's been a lot of where my work has been done, because it seems like as a low-hanging fruit item, a place I can understand quickly and try to extrapolate. How does this expand from here? So here's another photo of Kiribati after a king tide. You know, you're walking around ankle deep in water, people start to get an idea real quick, how am I going to deal with this? Well, a place like Kiribati is really far from anything. They've got about 2 planes a week, I think, at this day that come in and out. So being trapped is really part of that physical isolation, but also a place like the Maldives, where I spent a couple of years working. Even in Malé, you know, you've got these large mega cities that essentially look like they're floating, but again, you're 700 miles off the coast of Sri Lanka. Where are you going? You know, without a massive effort to move people, you can't just pick up and go 700 miles of ocean. So that's the difficulty of realizing we start talking about, everyone's moving. Where are these numbers coming from? Well, they physically have to move somewhere, and a plane only holds so many hundred, right? So it would take X amount of planes. You know, we start doing the math that people can't just show up overnight because it's really just not feasible. And also places like Alaska. So that's Kivalina Island, which is continuing to get bombarded by loss of the structure of their land because of the loss of the tundra. So we've got these types of places. But we also have circumstances, which brings us to the justice element. So those without access to transport, resources, or who can't move or who are already socially excluded, which leave a much lesser place where you can go. So one of those more obvious, or I should say, I guess maybe less obvious for people when they want to start talking about the xenophobia of who's coming, is our tribal communities in the US. They've been, the land that they have, not land that the US has been willing to negotiate to expand more on over the years, if we all are pretty well aware of that. So in any of these areas where things are either have a flooding, fires, if they leave, they lose the rights to that. And this is especially acute in New York, where you have, well, it gets harder to see on the map, some more loss of land due to coastal inundation. And again, with social exclusion, the US isn't just gonna be like, no problem, we'll just move your border back a little and you can take some more of that. That's not how we work. So we already are looking at those issues. Besides folks who might be elderly or babies, any sort of disability, you can't move as easily in these situations. So we think about the idea, the xenophobia that comes with large scale migration. And we forget that a lot of people just don't have the ability or are trapped by other circumstances that if we're not thinking through, leaves a huge justice element on the table. So your implications essentially are, we have to look at and start considering how long can people stay, by choice or by governance. How bad should we either let it get, or how bad are people letting themselves live before they make those decisions? And how do we facilitate that? That who falls through the cracks? Well, right now, internationally, that's been most of where my work has been, but not just who are across borders, but also felonies. The one major caveat to the UN Refugee Convention is that if you have committed a felony of any sort of seriousness, a government still doesn't have to take you. So even if you are a refugee and being persecuted, if you previously committed a crime, you do not have, no one has to do that. It's this weird human rights thing that's going to cause a lot of issues in the future of trying to figure out, do we leave behind people who have committed crimes? It's a tough one, right? It's a societal feature of safety. And that already is a weird crack that is open. There's also aid fatigue in terms of feeling like, oh, well, didn't we just hear about the last problem? How are we going to deal with the next one? So unless we're proactively thinking about what mechanisms can be helpful, how to help people make their own decisions to at least ease that process, we're just looking at more and more and more. And traditional land and tenure rights, which are really popular, but have a historical significance through the regions that I've worked in, even dealing in the US. Once you lose your house, right, you don't have a right to new land. So land rights, land access is going to be much more of a future problem. So I didn't want to leave too much, but essentially we've got a lot of work to do. And the complication of this continues to be a lot, but I'm happy to be at least trying to start thinking through some of these. And it's going to be quite the future problem for all of us. And maybe even personally, because we don't know how we'll all be impacted individually yet by these decisions as well.
Anyone want to jump in with some comments or questions?
Thanks, Andrea. That was great. So my question is about, so with some of these island nations that you're looking at, like the Seychelles and places like that, what is the sort of perceived fate of them under the like 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario? We got this global goal that we can mitigate the worst impacts of the future if we keep temperature change down to 1.5 degrees. But are those low-lying island nations kind of like doomed either way, or is the idea that 1.5 could save them?
They're still connected very heavily with the 1.5, most of the Pacific, so Kiribati, Tuvalu, the Marshall Islands, places like that. The 1.5 keeps them sort of functional as far as we're aware in terms of just modeling. But we're not obviously making good progress toward it, which has been their concern. Because otherwise, we're looking at a complete loss of all of that land. And while people have families across the Pacific, and that gives them at least somewhere to go, again, we still don't know where some people are going. Tuvalu has created an interesting initiative to try to map their entire small atoll system and upload it. I know that just sounds really weird, but they're recreating in the metaverse their world, which I don't know is the best outcome because it's not there anymore, but it's somewhere. And people are trying to find ways to keep their cultural heritage and their worlds alive. And the difficulty is when we don't have any good legal ways to figure out in what way can you keep that, especially the fishing waters, the geopolitical borders of that change really quickly. So They're definitely holding on to 1.5 as the last sort of mark they can hit before there's major problems, but we're already slowly seeing the deterioration of certain places. So they're trying.
To what extent does migration and displacement reversible? People once they come, how many go back?
Well, it's not going to be reversible in the sense that as we see impacts keep moving in the shift of our entire structure of how we created our cities, many of them are not going to be where we will not have the ability to do where we put them in the past based on impacts. So we have to look at this as a very long-term process. The way I think about it is sort of the systems kind of perspective of we've got the earth, we've got where we think we put everything and the permanence that we like to hold, right, as humans, and we're going to have to shift it all. So it's really going to be a movement, not just of people. Our agriculture sisters have to move. Our crops will not be able to grow where we grow them now. So this is a whole major thing of not just people, but where our cities have to go, where our food can go. So we really have to think of it as, I think, not a new permanence, but we have to start being the nomads of our past if we really want to think about how to manage something that will exponentially continue to change beneath our feet.
Take, for example, New Orleans, after the hurricane, there are a lot of displacement. But people would like to go back to where they were.
They'd like to, but a lot of people did not because they couldn't afford to get back and they couldn't afford to rebuild. So the lower ninth, the last time I was over there, still only had a spattering of homes because people couldn't afford. And that was a whole justice issue of multi-generations of homes and not having insurance. But a lot of people did not go back. They just couldn't afford it.
Incentives are given for them to return.
There aren't. Essentially, because there wasn't grocery stores close enough and the infrastructure died. And without having a grant to rebuild a house that you didn't have insurance on, a lot of people did not come back. They just had to go where they could get the next job and continue.
The COVID incidence was really fast, and there were just a lot of trapped communities. And are there any lessons that we learned from COVID in terms of community migration and all that, that we could, get that sort of understanding and apply it to climate?
That's a great question, because one thing that Tuvalu did, which when I originally got stuck out here, I was in the Marshall Islands when all the borders closed, so I was trapped on an island in the middle of, halfway between Australia and Hawaii. But what I did learn was of the neighbors. Tuvalu, especially since Brian had mentioned, you've got people moving from one place to another, and now that overloads systems. So for a long time, you have people from outer islands moving to the main island through the Futi. And so the government said, no, we can't do this. Like, everything's shut down. We don't have trade anymore. So go back to your islands. And they restarted and put money and effort into rebuilding old systems. So learning, relearning their older indigenous ways of drying fish and how to manage their communities the way they used to. And so you actually had to push back into those communities and a return to traditional ways of living. Because once everything got shut off, they didn't have the opportunity anymore to have the international trade that they used to. So the way that they were able to not have to overextend and have all of these issues was essentially going back to the old ways of doing things, which we should be really thinking about, because it's the only way we're going to decarbonize quickly. We actually look at quality of life issues instead of how do we keep our busy. And so they took a step back, and it was really successful.
Thank you, Andrea. I think we're gonna have to keep moving. That was great. Okay, our third speaker, Ivy. So, welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. Just put that in my pocket. All right, thank you. All right, well, I'm Ivy Main. I am a volunteer with the Sierra Club, which is the U.S. The largest grassroots environmental organization in the country. We have 20,000 members here in Virginia, including a group that's local to Richmond. So the Sierra Club has adopted climate change as our #1 topic for work. And we are fully engaged here at the General Assembly and with the State Corporation Commission that implements a lot of our energy laws. And so this is, for me, I work on legislation, I work on policy, I work on communication with people, because for all of the tools that we've been talking about here at this conference, this has been really interesting, all of the work that all of you are doing on climate change. But if we don't get the policy right, the tools don't get implemented. And one of the things that Virginia has done is to join the leading states in creating a framework to address climate change through policy. And so that's what I'm going to talk about here today, is that framework that we created. This all happened in 2020 and 2021. Until that time, Virginia, as you may know, has been a coal-heavy state. Our policies favored coal and natural gas. But, funny thing happened in 2020, Democrats took over not only the governorship, but both the House and the Senate. And it kind of released a great deal of pressure that had been building. And what we saw was just this flood of new laws creating a structure for an energy transition. And unfortunately, there's no reason climate change should be political. It's one of the most unfortunate things in this country that it really has become that way. It doesn't mean that it really is in terms of when you talk to people individually. So in fact, in each of these cases, we've had Republican support. It's been fairly modest, but I think, we certainly, those of you who are working with students and young people know that across the board, this is an issue for people. So I certainly the public polling supports what's happened and where we are today. So these are very popular laws. It's a series of laws that try to create a framework. We didn't get everything done. What we've done so far has been electric sector and transportation, much less in terms of buildings and industry, but it's a work in progress. So the first part of this was the Clean Energy and Community Flood Preparedness Act, which basically put Virginia into the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And that is a program of the northeastern states to bring down carbon emissions from power plants by 30% by 2030. And the way they do it is to have all the power plants have to buy emission allowances from an auction allowance system. And the auction allowances get less every year so that you can kind of ratchet down how many are produced. And the power plants, to be able to buy a carbon allowance, they're spending money. That money goes to the states, and the states can use it for things like energy efficiency that further reduce emissions. So it creates this kind of virtuous cycle. In Virginia, we split it between low-income energy efficiency and coastal adaptation and flood preparedness work. It's the only money that has gone to that so far. It has produced hundreds of millions already in dollars that are going to both adaptation programs and to the low-income energy efficiency programs. The next piece of this was the Virginia Clean Economy Act, which goes out beyond 2030. So we're continuing the auction allowance system. These are the two politicians who are primarily responsible for getting this legislation passed. Senator Jennifer McClellan is now a U.S. congressperson from the Richmond area. And then Delegate Rip Sullivan, who will, I think, become my delegate I'm from Northern Virginia. But this was obviously a work of the entire General Assembly working together. And it sets up this system of reduced carbon allowances year after year to 2050, at which point there's supposed to be zero carbon allowances sold. And that puts the pressure on all of our utilities to find ways to reduce their need for their fossil fuel plants. But the Virginia Clean Economy Act doesn't just say reduce carbon emissions. There's problems with that. There's lots and lots of ways that can not work very well. So the VCEA also gets very specific about how to do it. And one of them is telling the utilities, you're going to go out and close some of your fossil fuel plants. And so the coal plants are in Virginia are largely closing. There's some exceptions. There were some oil burning plants. Those are closing. I've got biomass plants will close. This year that kind of got rolled back a little bit, so they don't necessarily have to close. I think Dominion Energy, which has biomass plants, wants to close theirs because they're expensive and not really efficient anyway. And then the other thing is that it's that the VCEA set up a real barrier to building new fossil fuel plants. So until 2020, Dominion Energy had been planning to build new combined cycle gas plants. With the passage of the VCEA, that pretty much shut that down. And it made sense that it would, because as I'm sure you all know, solar energy is now the cheapest form of new energy in Virginia. So the interest in building new gas plants was something of a legacy, this really this forced the utilities to really rethink that maybe there's other ways to do it. So another thing that the VCEA requires is that the utilities actually have energy efficiency savings. And up until this point, we had all kinds of provisions in the law to encourage energy efficiency, but the utilities weren't required to do it. It wasn't in their interest. They weren't doing it. Now, as it turns out, it still turns out to be really hard to get utilities to do energy efficiency. And one of the reasons is, and I will mention this later if there's time, data centers. Data centers are now 20% of Dominion's energy load. They have been growing at an enormous rate. And if you're required to have energy efficiency savings at the time when your load is increasing from one particular industry, it's really, really hard to meet those energy efficiency requirements. It would mean that everything else would have to get better and better. But we do have this requirement, and there's the provision for the next few years, and then the State Corporation Commission is supposed to sort of take over and create the new targets. Note that in many cases, so the rural electric cooperatives are excluded from a number of the provisions of the VCEA, including the energy efficiency. They do have to meet the 2050 overall no emissions target, but they're left more on their own as to how they do it. Okay, so the other important thing is to get the utilities to ramp up renewable energy and energy storage. And the reason is that otherwise, as I said, the incentive might be to just buy power from out of state, from a place that doesn't have to meet our requirements. And we do not want to be buying more power from West Virginia, which is very coal heavy. So the VCEA actually tells Dominion and Appalachian Power that they need to meet a mandatory renewable portfolio standard, that they must propose these investments in wind and storage and solar, and also tells the State Corporation Commission that meeting these things is in the public interest and it should approve the projects when they come before them. So a renewable portfolio standard tells a utility that an increasing amount of its electricity should come from qualifying renewable energy resources. And there's a lot in that I will not get into because it's complicated, but the important thing is that you show this not just by building things, but by securing renewable energy certificates, which demonstrate that a particular electron has come from a renewable energy source and not from a fossil fuel source. So they show their compliance with the renewable portfolio standard by collecting these renewable energy certificates. They can come from their own facilities or they can buy them from somewhere else. So the BCEA is very careful about setting up where these renewable energy certificates can come from. And over time, it becomes, they have to be more and more from carbon-free wind and solar in Virginia. And that's sort of the gold standard where we're trying to get to. For the first few years, it's a little more lax. Notice also that nuclear is treated separately. So nuclear is a carbon-free source. It is not renewable energy, but because a big part of Dominion's resource load comes from nuclear, the VCEA makes provision for that by saying, first you subtract out the nuclear and then you apply the RPS to it. And so you get this interesting thing where it looks like Dominion has a harder time to meet the RPS, but actually Appalachian Power with no nuclear has a little tougher time. But the idea is that by the time we reach 2050, everything will be either nuclear or renewable energy. So the other way is to tell the utilities that they should go out and build or procure the renewable energy. And so there's a chart that tells them what they must do at what time. They have to go to the State Corporation Commission on a yearly basis and say, this is how we're planning to do it. We'd like to build these projects. And then the State Corporation Commission has to actually approve them. So far, things are on track. Both utilities have been doing this. Storage, there isn't a chart for storage. It just has to be by 2035. But again, they're doing it. It's part of the system. And then there's also separate provisions for offshore wind. And the reason is that at the moment, offshore wind is a more expensive resource. And if we're going to do it, then it took an extra force of will. And so that is provided for the current project that Dominion is building of it's like 2,600 megawatts of offshore wind that is under development now. They will start construction next year, and we will have it fully built out by 2026. This is actually a really exciting project. It will be the largest single offshore wind farm in the United States. One of the first here. Now, offshore wind is big in Europe, big across the globe, but it is a new industry here. It is more expensive, and so it did require a separate kind of treatment to make sure that it could go forward. Interestingly, in spite of it being more expensive, this has huge bipartisan support because of the job creation and the economic development pieces of it. You'll see 5,200 megawatts. Dominion's doing only half of that. The other half is sort of to be determined. There is a project off of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, that could provide the other half, or if we're able to build more offshore wind sort of further off Virginia Beach, that could also be the other half of it. But it's in place for us to do it as part of the framework. Another part of both the VCEA, but a separate law called Solar Freedom that Sierra Club was very heavily involved in. We worked with solar installers. This is about rooftop and distributed generation solar. And we were finding a lot of constraints in getting rooftop solar built. These were dealt with through the Solar Freedom and the VCEA. In addition, there was a bill to create a community solar program. That has been less successful. We're finding that the utilities are not incentivized to accept other people's projects onto the grid, basically. They don't make money when other people build solar. So there have been other barriers that kind of popped up that we did not realize would happen. So the next part of the transfer of the decarbonization framework is the transportation sector. 2021, Virginia adopted the Clean Car Standard, which means we follow California's rules, and that most immediately meant for us that we would get the automobile dealers to carry more electric cars, but it also means that we're now adopting California's rules about the transition to electric vehicles. So that's been very controversial. Say California to anybody in the General Assembly, and they don't like to hear that. So, but there's a great deal of consensus around electrifying school buses. So we have funds to do that, and that has been wildly successful. It's there's not enough funding for it, but that is something that is underway. And then also there is interestingly a lot of acceptance of the idea that you should do a cost-benefit analysis of state fleets, and if it turns out that electric is a cheaper way for total cost of ownership for the state, that we should be using electric vehicles there, and that's been very successful as well. So beyond the Virginia Clean Economy Act, now that the VCEA is electric sector, but obviously there is far more than the electric sector. So the Commonwealth energy policy is sort of this vague policy. It used to be where you would sort of dump every idea you had for what would be good to support. But it's not law, it's policy, it's what we encourage. And so that in 2020 was also changed to say carbon-free electricity by 2040, not 2050. And net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2045. So again, not 2050. So it's much more ambitious. It's much more in line with what we know the science requires. But again, it doesn't mandate it. It kind of just says this is where we would like to go in future years. The things we haven't gotten to yet. I mentioned data centers. We're really going the wrong direction there. A lot of these data center operators talk about sustainability. They're not doing it in Virginia. They are not meeting their requirements with renewable energy. We're going to have to deal with that. We have a campaign in the works to take that on. Building electrification and building codes have been a big issue. Virginia does not adopt the highest national building code standards. We're lagging behind. We also have a program, a campaign trying to improve that because buildings are such a big part of the carbon problem. Solar siting is becoming an issue. We're getting a lot of pushback from rural communities who don't see local benefits from building out solar. The sheep there, because I think if you can do sheep and pollinators, people start seeing those local benefits. Nuclear, as I mentioned, it's provided for in the VCEA, but there's nothing there that specifically encourages further nuclear development like SMRs. I think there's a real question as to whether that's going to be helpful in the next decade or not. As I mentioned, the electric cooperatives are kind of out there on their own. Hydrogen, where I think everybody believes there's a future in hydrogen. We're not seeing, it's way too early in Virginia with how little renewable energy we have now before hydrogen becomes a big part of it. So when we talk about why we have so many things that are not yet addressed, a lot of that changed in 2022 when the governorship changed and the makeup of the General Assembly changed, and that kind of brought things to a screeching halt here in Virginia. But we have successfully defended these laws at the General Assembly, so they are still the law, and they are with the addition of the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill and all the great stuff that is happening at the federal level, we're really getting a tailwind. So the VCEA was kind of a perfect structure to incorporate the benefits that are coming from the federal government. So, in terms of building renewable energy, now suddenly you've got far more incentives. You've got the energy efficiency tax incentives, the EV credits. So all of these are going to help us meet our 2050 goals, and rather in spite of some of the naysayers at the state leadership. So Governor Youngkin ran against all of these parts of the framework. He has failed to repeal them at the General Assembly. Currently, he is trying to get Virginia out of the regional greenhouse gas emission by regulation. So he has got the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality to propose a regulation to remove us from RGGI. That question whether that's legal, because it was a statute that put us in. So there's that may end up in court on that. And I don't want to say it's not been, as I said, he does support the offshore wind. There's been plenty of support for research and development. He does have a preference for next decade technology. So he'd like to see Virginia become a leader in small modular nuclear reactors and hydrogen, and is putting money in the budget to support R&D for that. It's kind of an attempt to talk about what happens 10 years from now instead of what happens now. And I think that's really unfortunate, but those are sexy topics, right? Yeah, SMRs and hydrogen. So that's what we get. And that's it for me.
Thank you. Do you have any comments or questions? Brian.
So that was a really great talk, and I appreciate those insights. One thing that we've been thinking about is unintended consequences, and with the as you said, the disincentives for utilities to support solar installations on other people's properties and so forth. One of the things we've been seeing is a concern about deforestation associated with large solar farms. And I wonder, are you tracking that? Are you, as you're kind of thinking about implementation of these programs and just being aware of where, I mean, you mentioned about needing to work with rural communities and so forth, but they're just buying up tracts of land and then putting the solar farms there. And that does have long-term implications for carbon storage as well as ecosystem services.
Right. So there's, I guess, and I'm sure that you or others could address this part better than I am. My understanding is that from a addressing climate change aspect, the value of the solar is greater than the value of the forest. That said, I am a tree hugger first and foremost. And if it's a mixed hardwood forest, it really hurts to see those. What we're seeing more often is solar on either farmland that's not currently being used, or some that has, and they can't make money anymore on it, or cutting of pine plantations. And I don't know how you feel, but I couldn't care less about a pine plantation. So I think we have to distinguish there as to what kind of forest we're talking about. There was a bill passed last year that is causing all kinds of headaches for the solar industry that essentially requires mitigation for putting solar on prime agricultural land or forest land. Mitigation, unfortunately, undefined very well. So it's in a working group that isn't getting very far, but it was really driven by the rural people who, they talk a good game about doing anything you want with your land, but it's like, you can do anything you want with your land, but you can't do solar. So we're seeing a great deal of that kind of sentiment that I think is very unfortunate. I do think that it's really important that people see the benefits of solar in their communities through sheep grazing, pollinators, things that improve it. But there is a good deal of sense that you hear from people that, we don't want to lose farmland, we don't lose forests, and I kind of think, well, 40% of corn crops are going for corn ethanol, right? So that's 30 million acres of land across the country that we could probably put solar on and improve matters. Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah, if I could, we actually do have data on this. We do have data on this from a study that a Master's of Urban Regional Planning student at VCU did 2 years ago. So as of the first 35 utility scale solar projects in Virginia, about, if I can recall, about 60% of the land that was converted had been forest land, 25% cropland. That percentage is largely skewed by one gigantic project outside of Fredericksburg that until recently was the largest utility scale solar project in the eastern US. And that project was almost entirely forest land. It's right outside of the wilderness Civil War site. But within that 60% of forested land, the significant majority of that was kind of like marginal forest land, not according to like the metrics of conservation value. It was mostly kind of like middle to lower grade forests. The cropland, the 25% that had been converted from cropland, was actually mostly high value cropland. So that's a little bit of a weird kind of like situation there. We will hopefully, so that student now works with the Virginia Department of Energy and is, I believe, going to shortly be hiring the Institute of Sustainable Energy Environment to do a version 2.0 of that. So, which will hopefully be publicized in the fall. Yeah.
Thanks for adding that context.
Go ahead.
I liked your last answer on 30% of the corn goes to fuel production, which is almost same. But my question is, how cooperative the utility companies are encouraging people to put rooftop solar panels? Do they really work with it, or sort of they discourage customers to put roof panels?
Like
utilities? Suppose if I have to put a roof panel, you go on their website, there is all general information. They will not tell you stepwise what is the step, right? Okay, get a contractor. This is how you connect to the grid. So to me, they're trying to sort of discourage customers coming in. Is that a valid?
That's absolutely right, because they don't make money on power they can't sell. So if a customer self-supplies their electricity, then that's one less customer buying their power. So the incentives are not perfectly aligned there, and that there are, I think, ways to deal with it, but we haven't done it.
I'm from Indiana, and just really my experience, I want to put a heat pump, and I want to get some idea from the AEP, which is a provider. They go to customer service, and these guys have no clue about what I'm talking about. So there is no technical support to tell you, okay, these are the requirements, and this is what it means. Nothing there.
So I will say the Virginia Department of Energy has been really working to get information out. They have been doing a terrific job on implementing the Inflation Reduction Act into their programs and to help particularly localities, but also I think individuals more and more.
Maybe one last question if there's, okay.
I'm loud. I'm a solar owner. I have, and I love having it. The grid does me a tremendous service, storing my excess production in the spring and summer into the fall. I pay $7.90 to be hooked up to the grid for 10 months out of the year. And it's wonderful. I love it. But I could see Dominion saying, you're sort of a freeloader because we're saving, I think I was up to 1,600 kilowatt hours of surplus at the end of the summer before it started paying out. Is there a balance between a reasonable fee to solar owners? Because some states seem like they get to a point where they start going, oh, you guys are making out too well. And they install punitive sort of criteria for solar owners. What do you feel about that?
So yeah, the biggest impediment to people installing solar now is still that they run the numbers and say, well, it won't pay off by the time I expect to leave my house. So on the one hand, yes, other people are kind of subsidizing you. On the other hand, if we agree that what we need is a lot more solar everywhere, then in fact, you're doing a public service to the rest of us. Where is that balance? Right now, Dominion has not had to go and ask for an increase in its base rates. So there's no shift to anybody else that we have seen so far because they haven't had to ask for that to happen. We've seen increases in California just totally. California is a very different circumstance. They have a lot more solar. What they're finding is that they're now integrating home batteries into the systems, and that allows time of use, time shifting. That is certainly where everybody else will go eventually. In Virginia, the part of the Solar Freedom Compromise was that in 2024 for Appalachian Power and 2025 for Dominion, net metering becomes a subject of study at the State Corporation Commission, and all bets are off at that point. The SEC has not been a fan of net metering, so we don't know what's going to happen. Realistically, 2024, that's next year, will be where the big fight happens at the SEC, and we'll see what comes out of the new structure going forward. And hopefully it is something that works for everyone. At the moment, if everybody went out and put batteries on their solar systems, that would be a net loss for the climate, because every one of those storage systems has an environmental footprint of its own. So if we can't use those for grid services, then you got a big carbon footprint without the benefit. So we don't want to force everybody just to put batteries on only for their own use. It makes sense only if it is being used for the grid. So I'm hopeful that that's kind of where things will evolve, but we'll see.
We're running low on time, but I'll go for one last question.
I talk too much.
I'm Alan Jones. I'm the chair of the IEEE Richmond section. One of the things with net energy metering is we as residential customers pay a flat rate 24 hours a day. but the wholesale rate of electricity is not flat at all. It changes every 5 minutes. So the time of the day that the peak energy consumption happens is about 7 p.m., which is when solar has gone away and wind's not generating a whole lot. The peak output is during the middle of the day. And what California is running into is something that they actually predicted like 10 years ago. It's something called the duck curve. So you've got solar, rooftop solar that people are getting. If you're on net energy metering, you're getting paid above the wholesale rate to pump electricity into the grid that they don't have a need for in the middle of the day, and expecting somebody else to store it for you so that it will be available at 7 p.m. And that's where they're starting to go, we can't keep doing this. Another thing that they identified, again, like a decade ago, before anybody was talking about equity and all that kind of stuff, is the electric companies don't really make money off of selling electricity. As strange as that sounds, what they make money off of is building. So over 100 years ago, a concept called the regulatory compact got developed to help electrify the nation very quickly. And they earn about 10% rate of return off of everything that they build. So the more they build, the more money they make. The rest is mostly passed through. And so they're guaranteed, a certain rate of return. So if you're doing net energy metering, you're not paying for any of that infrastructure. And again, a decade ago, it was pointed out that if you could afford to put solar on your house, then the people who were paying for the infrastructure were the people who could not afford to put solar on their house. So they were paying for the infrastructure for your house in addition to theirs. And that's where you're starting to see some of the pushback on the net energy metering.
These are hypothetical concerns that are arguably occurring in California and Hawaii now, but these are debates that have been used to stifle distributed solar in its infancy all across the country for, as you said, like over a decade. The solution is not to envision this like worst case scenario and say that's the reason why we shouldn't have distributed solar. The solution is to have distributed solar and avoid that problem through storage, time of use rates, electric vehicles, all these other types of scenarios. So I appreciate you mentioning that comment as a problem, but I just need to clarify that that is a narrative that's being pushed for disingenuous reasons all across the country.
I'm not saying that you should not have distributed solar, but everybody wants to be the one that gets all of the economic benefit and doesn't pay for the infrastructure. So we've got to come up with.
It's a reasonable point that the fair solution is not the free ride that we currently have as rooftop solar owners, but the solution is also definitely not to create these barriers that many people have been trying to create to stop us.
And I will say one of the things when I have more time for a discussion like this, I have a slide about equity in the framework. We have there are a number of provisions within the VCEA to make sure that we're not burdening lower income people, including something called a payment of income, a percentage of income payment program that limits how much lower income people will have to pay for electricity, plus provisions for energy efficiency, but also solar, so that we're trying to compensate for some of that. Right now, we're still at a point where, as I say, most people who look at solar are running the numbers. And if we really want solar everywhere, and we need solar everywhere. As Professor Pitt says, we need to figure out how we can do that, incentivize that, and minimize cost to other people. But rooftop solar has to be part of the program. It can be a big part, but it is complicated.
I think electric utilities are really concerned about the impacts of rising electricity costs on low-income consumers. There's a whole lot more that they could have been doing for the past 15 years and could still do today.
And I think we're going to have to end it with that heated discussion. Thank you, Ivy. Thank you, everyone.